You wake in the modest clay brick room before the sun clears the horizon. The first pale light seeps through a narrow window set high in the wall, its wooden shutter cracked open just enough to let the cool morning air drift across your face. A rooster calls somewhere near the granary, a thin, wavering cry that fades into the rustle of a pigeon settling on the roof tiles. Far away, beyond the low hum of waking birds, a single trumpet note rings out from the legionary fortress. It is the signal for the change of the night watch, a clean, distant brass sound that rises and falls without urgency. You sit up slowly on the straw-filled mattress, feeling the coarse linen sheet slip from your shoulder. The floor is smooth packed earth, cool under your bare feet as you stand. Your tunic of undyed wool hangs from a peg beside the door, and you pull it over your head, the fabric smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried sweat. You reach for your sandals, their leather soles worn soft and shaped to your own steps, and tie the straps loosely around your ankles. The room is small but orderly. A clay water jar near the window, a wooden stool with a bowl of dried figs, a small oil lamp on a niche shelf whose flame you breathe out with a soft puff so that only the grey thread of smoke remains. The day begins without hurry, one motion folding into the next. In the corner of the room, a small charcoal brazier holds the remains of last evening's fire, cold grey ash dotted with tiny black fragments. You crouch beside it, take a scrap of dry kindling and lay it carefully over a new handful of charcoal, leaving the brazier unlit for now because your breakfast will be cold. You pour a little water from the clay jar into a shallow cup, dip a piece of flat barley bread into it, and eat standing by the window, watching the light shift from slate to pearl. The bread is dense and slightly sour, the water cool and faintly earthy from the jar, and together they settle your stomach without drawing attention to themselves. You take a second piece, chew it more slowly, and let your gaze wander over the rooftops of the civilian settlement that huddles against the fortress wall. The bathhouse furnace is already sending a thin column of smoke into the sky, and somewhere a woman calls softly to a child, the sound swallowed almost at once by the distance. When you have finished, you pour a little of the remaining water over your hands, rub them clean, and dry them on the hem of your tunic. You step out through the low doorway and onto the gravel path that leads past the potter's kilns and the fuller's workshop toward the western gate of the fortress. The morning air carries a blend of smells: cold stone, fresh stamped earth, the clean bitterness of the smoke from the bathhouse, and beneath it all the faint metallic tang that your own skin seems to release when you think of the forge. You walk with a steady, unhurried pace, your hobnailed sandals grinding softly on the gravel, each step a muted crunch that blends into the next. A mule cart passes you with a driver who nods without speaking, the wooden wheels groaning under a load of clay amphorae, and then the lane grows quiet again. To your left, the fortress wall rises in massive blocks of dressed limestone, their surfaces rough with chisel marks and weathered to a pale honey color. The morning dew still clings to the mortar joints, darkening them in irregular patches. A sentry stands high above the gate, a silhouette against the brightening sky, motionless except for the slow turn of his helmet plume in the breeze. You pass beneath the shadow of the gate itself, and feel the sudden drop in temperature, the shade cool on your neck, before you emerge on the other side, where your smithy waits in a row of workshops built against the fortress's outer wall. The wooden door is broad and heavy, its iron hinges blackened with age, and the small window beside it is shuttered from the inside. You draw the bolt with a single long scrape of metal on metal, push the door open, and step inside. The smell of the workshop greets you first, a dry, still presence of iron dust, charcoal, old leather, quenching oil, and the faintest trace of beeswax from the tool handles. The air is motionless and holds the memory of yesterday's heat, a warmth that is no longer felt, but still somehow lingers in the corners. You leave the door open behind you, so the grey morning light pours in and shows you the familiar shapes of the space: the anvil on its oaken block, the forge with its tall chimney, the tool rack on the wall, and the workbench where a pile of damaged armor rests under a length of coarse cloth. You walk to the bench first, not to begin the repairs, but simply to check that everything is as you left it. You lift a corner of the cloth and see the dented cheek guard of a bronze helmet catching the light, the cracked shin guard of an iron greave, the stack of segmentata chest plates with their leather ties hanging loose. All is in order. You let the cloth fall back and turn to the forge. The fire bowl is a wide, shallow depression lined with fire brick. Its surface a patchwork of grey ash and blackened lumps of half-burned charcoal from the day before. You take a small iron rake from a hook on the wall and gently stir the cold ash, breaking apart the clumps and sifting out any bits of clinker that have fused into glassy black pebbles. Each clinker drops into the ash bucket with a soft tink, and when the bowl is clean, you set the rake aside and reach for a bundle of dry kindling tied with a twist of straw. The twigs are brittle and snap under your fingers as you break them into short lengths, arranging them in a loose nest at the center of the bowl. Around the kindling you place a circle of fresh charcoal nuggets, each one dull and lightweight, their surfaces covered with a fine black dust that clings to your fingers. You take a deep breath, not of effort but of settling, and feel the quiet of the empty workshop fold around you. From a small pottery jar on the mantel, you shake out a few scraps of charcloth, tinder so fine it will catch the smallest spark, and lay them gently in the heart of the kindling. Your flint and steel lie beside the jar, the steel a curved loop of iron worn smooth at the striking edge, the flint a chunk of dark glossy stone with razor tips. You hold the steel over the tinder and strike downward with the flint once, twice, the sound a sharp dry click, and on the third strike a tiny orange spark jumps into the charcloth and immediately grows into a tiny circle of red light. You lift the nest of kindling, bring it close to your lips, and blow with a long, steady stream of air, so the glow spreads from the center outward, kindling the dry twigs until a small flame licks upward, pale yellow and almost transparent in the daylight. You set the burning nest back into the forge bowl and add a few more twigs, watching the fire find its footing. For a minute or two, you simply watch the flames move, low and lazy, curling around the edges of the charcoal as if testing it. The wood pops once. A tiny sound like a mouse in the wall, and a thin curl of blue smoke rises into the chimney. You reach for the bellows handle, a wooden lever that extends from the side of the forge, and press it down gently. The leather bellows wheeze, a soft rush of air that is half whisper and half sigh, and the charcoal responds at once by glowing brighter, the black surfaces turning to a deep orange crust. You lift the handle, press again, establishing a slow rhythm that feels as natural as walking. Down and up, the air hissing through the tie-air pipe into the base of the fire. With each stroke, the glow deepens, the heat spreads, and the faint smell of hot iron begins to wake in the room. Your arm finds the motion and keeps it without thought. The handle creaks ever so slightly at the hinge, a sound that has been part of this workshop longer than you have, a sound that belongs to the early morning. You watch the firebed brighten from a dull rust color to a rich cherry red, the charcoal pieces shrinking and cracking as they release their stored energy. Tiny sparks rise now, not by the handful, but one by one, drifting upward like fireflies caught in a narrow shaft of light. They climb the dark chimney throat, flicker, and vanish before they can reach the outside air. The day's first true warmth touches your face and forearms, a welcome pressure of heat that promises nothing hurried, only the steady unfolding of the hours ahead. You release the bellows handle and let the fire settle for a moment. The coals breathe on their own, glowing and cooling in a slow pulse that matches something deep in your chest. Outside the open door, the world has grown brighter. You can hear the distant rhythmic shouting of a centurion drilling his men on the parade ground. The sound a muffled cadence that rises and falls like the sound of waves on a shingle beach. Closer, a sparrow lands on the windowsill, tilts its head, and flies off again. The scent of baking flatbread from the garrison ovens drifts in, mingling with the charcoal smoke, and you think briefly of the brazier in your room, the cold breakfast you have already eaten, and the long stretch of the day that now lies comfortable and predictable before you. You take the iron rake once more and push the glowing coals into a neat mound at the center of the forge, making a hot core from which you can draw heat later in the morning. Around the edges you place a few fresh lumps of charcoal, so they can begin to dry and warm, ready to be pushed into the fire when needed. The arrangement is careful but not fussy, a small ritual that your hands have performed so many times they no longer need your eyes. You lay the rake on its hook, wipe your fingers on the rag that hangs from your leather apron, and turn at last to the workbench where the armor waits. A wooden stool stands beside the bench, its seat polished dark by use. You hitch your tunic, settle onto the stool, and pull the coarse cloth aside to reveal the full array of the day's tasks. The bronze helmet gleams dully under the high window, its dent the size of a child's fist. Beside it, the iron greave bears a crack like a dark thread drawn across the metal. The chest plates of the lorica segmentata are stacked like thick ceramic tiles, each one still carrying traces of dried sweat and oil. A section of chainmail sits folded to one side, a heavy limp net of interlocked rings, and a gladius with a blunted edge leans against the bench leg as if waiting its turn. You touch none of them yet. Instead, you let your gaze travel over each piece, reading its surface the way a farmer reads the sky, noting the angle of the dent, the width of the crack, the number of broken leather ties, and the pattern of missing rings in the mail. The assessment is calm, quiet, and complete. After a little while, you stand and walk to the rack of tools. Hammers of various sizes hang from iron hooks, their handles worn smooth and dark with sweat and oil. You select a small punishing hammer with a slightly domed face, a crosspeen that tapers to a blunt wedge, and a light ball peen that feels like an extension of your knuckles. You lay them on the bench alongside a flat file, a small anvil stake shaped like a bent finger, a pair of thin-nosed pliers, and a length of soft iron wire no thicker than a barley stalk. Each tool settles onto the wood with a small dull sound, arranged in the order you will use them, from left to right. You go to the quenching bucket, a tall clay jar half full of water with a faint skin of oil floating on its surface, and you top it up from a smaller jug so that the water rises to the proper level. You dip a finger in, feel the coolness, and nod to yourself. Now you pause. The shop is ready. The coals glow in the forge with a steady, patient heat audible only as a very low hum if you lean close. The tools are laid out, the armor is waiting, and the quality of the light has shifted from the thin grey of dawn to the full pale gold of early morning. You can hear, very faintly, the sound of water trickling from the overflow pipe of the bathhouse aqueduct, a sound so continuous and soft it is almost silence itself. A bell strikes somewhere in the fortress, marking the first hour of the day, 9 slow notes that blend into the hum of the forge and the distant commands of the drill field. You stand still for a short while, not resting, not thinking, simply present in the middle of the space you have made warm and orderly, and then you pick up the helmet and the planishing hammer, turn them over in your hands, and begin the slow work of repair. With the fire now climbing to a soft, even glow, and the coals settled into a steady bed of deep orange heat, you pull the wooden stool away from the wall and carry it to the workbench. The stool legs scrape once against the packed earth floor before you set them down squarely. You sit, adjust your tunic where it bunches behind your knees, and let your shoulders drop. The morning light from the high window has grown fuller, no longer grey, but a clean, pale gold that falls across the bench in a long slanting rectangle. Dust motes drift in and out of the light, unhurried, as if they too are part of the workshop's slow breathing. The coarse cloth still covers the pile of damaged armor, its surface faintly rippled by the shakes beneath. And for a long moment you simply look at it, letting the quiet settle deeper. Before you disturb anything, you reach forward and take the edge of the cloth between your thumb and forefinger, lifting it slowly so the fabric rustles with a dry, papery sound. The smell that rises is a blend of old metal, tired leather, and the faint saltiness of dried sweat, a smell that is not unpleasant but simply familiar, like the scent of a tool handle after years of use. You fold the cloth back onto itself in 3 neat sections, first 1/3, then another, until it lies as a thick pad at the far end of the bench. Beneath it, the armor pieces are revealed all at once, and even though you have seen them before while checking the shop, they now seem more distinct in this dedicated light, each one holding its damage like a quiet question. The helmet is the first thing you notice because its bronze surface catches the light and throws it back in a dull honey-colored gleam. It is a cavalry helmet, not the full-face type, but an open-face design, with broad cheek guards that sweep down and curve inward. The shallow dent on the right cheek guard is the most obvious flaw, a depression about the size of a child's fist that warps the smooth curve like a dimple in soft clay. Around the dent, the metal shows a faint circle of lighter color, where the bronze has been stressed, and you can just make out a few tiny stress lines radiating outward, fine as hairs. The rest of the helmet is in decent condition. The brow guard is straight, the neck flange is free of cracks, and the rivets holding the crest mount are all tight. You lift the helmet with both hands, feeling the satisfying weight of it, and turn it over to check the inside. The leather suspension liner is still intact, the padded straps dry but not yet rotten, and the iron ring at the crown where the crest would be attached is free of rust. You set the helmet down on the left side of the bench, its empty face turned upward, and you know without writing anything down that it will be the first piece you repair. Beside where the helmet had rested lies the greave, a shin guard for the right leg. It is made of iron rather than bronze. Its surface a dark charcoal grey that has been smoothed by use and oiled many times. You pick it up and hold it horizontally, so the light runs along its length, and there you see the crack, a fine dark line that begins at the upper curve near the knee and travels down for the length of your middle finger before stopping just short of the ankle flare. The crack is not wide enough to let light through, but it is a true split in the metal, not just a surface scratch, and you can feel its edges with the pad of your thumb as a very slight ridge. The greave's shape is otherwise sound. It still hugs the wooden leg form beside the anvil when you test fit it in your mind, and the two brass buckles on the back are both present with their leather straps intact. You run your palm over the slightly convex outer face, tracing the geography of a dozen old hammer marks that have long since been planished smooth, and you note the even thickness that speaks of careful forging. You place the greave beside the helmet, its concave inner face turned down so the crack is visible from above. Next is the bundle of segmentata chest plates, stacked one on top of another with a piece of old sacking between each to prevent scratching. You lift the stack as a whole and place it in the center of the bench, then begin separating the plates one by one. There are 8 plates in total, each one a curved rectangle of iron roughly the length of your forearm and the width of your hand. They are thinner than the greave, about the thickness of a clay roof tile, because their strength comes not from mass, but from the way they overlap and are held together by internal leather straps. As you examine the first plate, you see exactly what you expected. The metal itself is in fine condition, free of dents or cracks, but the leather ties that should connect it to its neighbors are frayed and cracked. Tiny splits run along the fold lines where the leather has been bent back and forth, and in 2 places the leather has snapped entirely, leaving only a short dry stub protruding from the brass loop. You turn the plate over and check the iron loops themselves. Small brass rectangles riveted to the inside surface, and all of them are secure. The second plate shows the same pattern, good metal, tired leather. The third and fourth are much the same, though on the fourth plate, one of the brass loops has pulled slightly loose, the rivet wiggling when you press it with your fingernail. You tap it once to test the movement, then set it aside mentally for recinching later. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th plates all pass through your hands with the same quiet examination, and by the time you have stacked them again in a neat column, you have built a clear picture of what is needed. A full set of new leather strapping, 1 tightened rivet, and a light cleaning to remove the bloom of surface rust that has begun to appear on the inner faces. To the right of the segmentata plates, folded into a dense, heavy square like a fisherman's net made of iron, sits the section of chainmail. You lift it with both hands, and even though it is only a partial sleeve meant to cover the upper arm, it weighs more than you expect. The thousands of tiny interlocked rings pulling downward with a fluid, liquid heaviness. You lay the chainmail gently on the bench and spread it out, untucking the folded edges and smoothing the mesh so that it lies as flat as its own nature will allow. The rings are small, each one no wider than the nail on your smallest finger, and they alternate in a pattern of solid punched rings and riveted rings, the standard 4-in-1 weave that every armorer in the Legion workshops knows by heart. As your eyes travel across the surface, you quickly find the damage. A stretch of perhaps a dozen rings in the center of the patch has been torn open. The links snapped and curled back like tiny claws. Around the tear, a handful of other rings are stretched and distorted, their once round shapes pulled into narrow ovals that will need replacing as well. You lift the edge of the tear and count the missing rings. 7 solid rings, 5 riveted rings. The repair will require you to sit for a long while with the small pliers and the coil of wire, opening and closing links one at a time, but the work is not difficult, only patient. You fold the chainmail back into itself, not as tightly as before, and place it at the far right end of the bench, and there is the gladius. It leans against the bench leg, where you had left it, the tip resting on a folded scrap of leather to protect the floor and the pommel angled outward. You reach down and pick it up, drawing it into the light. The sword is a standard legionary pattern, the blade just under 2 feet long, double-edged, with a sharp triangular point. The hilt is wrapped in ridged bone, yellowed with age, and the round wooden pommel is solidly pegged, no wobble at all. The blade itself tells the story, a series of small nicks along the forward edge, each one no bigger than a grain of barley, clustered in the middle third where the cutting action happens during drills against the wooden post. The tip has a very slight curl, barely visible, as if the point had been jammed into something hard and then withdrawn. The fuller groove running down the center of the blade is clean and free of rust, which tells you the soldier who owns this sword oils it regularly even if he does not yet sharpen it himself. You hold the blade up and sight along the edge, seeing the tiny irregularities magnified against the light. Then lay the gladius flat on the bench above the chainmail, the edge facing away from you for safety, even though it is currently dull enough to run your thumb across without drawing blood. The sharpening and honing will come later, after the armor repairs are done, a way to finish the day on a single clean note. Now the bench holds the full array, each piece in its place. From left to right, the bronze helmet with its shy dent, the cracked iron greave, the tall stack of segmentata plates needing new leather, the folded chainmail sleeve with its torn patch, and the blunt gladius awaiting its turn. Behind them, against the wall, your tools hang in their accustomed order, and on the bench beside the armor you have already laid out the small planishing hammer, the cross-peen, and the ball-peen from your first movements of the morning. But the sorting work of this chapter is not yet complete, because the tools must match the tasks as carefully as the tasks have been arranged from left to right. You rise from the stool, your knees popping softly, and walk the 2 steps to the tool rack. The rack is a length of seasoned oak, bolted to the wall, with iron hooks driven in at regular intervals. Each hook holds a tool by its handle or by a leather loop, and below each tool a small soot-blackened label scratched into the wood names it, in case your memory should ever falter, though it never does. You run your eyes along the row, touching nothing at first. The large straight peen hammer, used for drawing out heavy stock, hangs on the left. You pass it by because today's work requires finer hands. The rounding hammer, with its 2 differently curved faces, also stays where it is. Your fingers finally close around the handle of the small planishing hammer, the one you had already taken, and you lift it free, its weight a comfortable promise. Beside it hangs the cross-peen, its wedge-shaped peen set at a right angle, good for spreading metal in a controlled line. You lift it down and add it to the collection on the bench. A third hammer, a tiny ball peen no longer than your hand, you take for detailed work on the rivets. 3 hammers, 3 different weights, each one chosen for a specific set of taps and blows that will unfold over the hours ahead. The stakes are stored on a lower shelf beneath the rack, each one a shaped piece of iron with a square tang that slots into the hardy hole of the anvil. You kneel and sort through them. There is a long tapering cone for working rings and curves, a flat-topped block for straightening, and the one you need now, a short rounded stake that resembles a bent thumb, its surface polished bright by years of helmets being pressed against it. You lift it, blow a fleck of dust from its tang, and carry it to the anvil, slotting it into the hardy hole with a firm downward push. The stake sits there solidly, ready to receive the dented cheek guard later. For the greave, you do not need a special stake because you will be welding a patch over the crack, but you will need a small steel wire brush for cleaning the weld area and a clay pot of borax flux. The brush hangs on a nail near the forge, its bristles worn down to stubble, and you fetch it and place it beside the greave. The borax flux sits in a small lidded jar on the mantle, a white powder you have ground yourself from raw crystals, and you bring it to the bench as well, setting it next to the pliers. The pliers themselves are a pair of thin-nosed tongs with well-aligned jaws, tools you use exclusively for chainmail work. They hang on their own hook, and you lift them down and lay them crosswise over the folded chainmail section. Beside them you place the coil of soft iron wire from which you will cut new rings, the coil about the size of a sparrow's nest, wound tight and dark with mill scale. A small cold chisel and a tiny riveting hammer, no bigger than your thumb, complete the set for the mail repair. For the segmentator plates, the main tool is a sharp leather awl with a polished bone handle, used for punching new holes in the replacement leather straps. You find it in the small clay pot on the corner of the bench where small tools are kept points down, and you draw it out, testing its point against the ball of your thumb until you feel the faintest prick. The coarse file, a flat bastard file with a worn wooden handle, will be needed for the sword edge and for smoothing the weld on the greave. But for now you take it from its hook and place it near the middle of the bench where both tasks can reach it. A finer file, a smooth cut with a curved back, joins it for the delicate finishing work on the helmet. You step back and survey the bench. Each piece of armor now has its corresponding tools arranged around it like a small, dedicated workspace. The helmet's stake is already in the anvil, its planishing hammer waiting. The greave has its wire brush, borax jar, and the small section of low carbon iron patch plate you had cut the previous week and left on the shelf, which you now retrieve and add to the grouping. The segmentator stack has the awl, a sharp knife for cutting leather, and a spool of waxed linen thread that you set beside it, even though you had not originally reached for it, knowing that a few stitches will likely be needed to secure the new straps. The chainmail section has the pliers, the wire coil, and the tiny riveting hammer, and the gladius has the whetstone and the strop, both of which still sit in their own corner near the water bucket, where you will use them when the later hours arrive. But you mentally mark their place so you do not forget. You pull the stool back to the bench and sit down again, your weight settling into the familiar groove. The arrangement in front of you now feels complete. A map of the day, drawn in metal and wood. No piece is out of order, no tool is missing, and the stillness of the workshop has grown even deeper, as if the very walls are holding their breath in anticipation of the quiet work ahead. The forge hums behind you with its low, constant respiration, the coals occasionally shifting with a soft tink as one lump settles and another expands. The high window now shows a patch of sky that has brightened from pale gold to a clear, washed blue, and the dust motes have drifted lower, fewer of them dancing in the shaft of light. Outside, the sounds of the fortress have settled into their own mid-morning routine. The distant rhythm of marching boots has stopped, replaced by the closer noise of a cart rumbling past the workshop door, its driver calling something indistinct to a gate guard, and then the cart fades away and the world returns to a quiet broken only by the occasional call of a gull circling above the river that runs half a mile to the south. You place your hands flat on the bench and feel the cool grain of the wood, the tiny dents and scratches left by years of work pressing into your palms. The routine of sorting, checking, and placing has done its work on you as surely as it has on the tools and the armor. Your breathing has slowed without your notice. Your thoughts have grown smooth and uncluttered, and the long, slow curve of the day now seems not like a stretch of hours to be endured, but like a calm, predictable landscape through which you will walk at an easy pace. You pull the helmet toward you, rest its cool bronze weight against your left palm, and pick up the punishing hammer in your right hand, the handle fitting into the calloused hollow of your grip, as if it had grown there. The first light tap of the day is only a breath away. With the bench now ordered and the tools waiting in their places, you lift a bronze helmet from its spot on the left side of the work table. The metal is cool against your palms, its surface carrying the faint chill of the early morning that still lingers in the workshop corners. You turn the helmet slowly in your hands, letting the light from the high window slide across the cheek guard where the shallow dent interrupts the otherwise smooth curve. The depression is not deep, perhaps the thickness of your smallest finger, but it catches the eye because the reflection of the window distorts as it passes over the warped area, bending the straight line of the sill into a soft wobble. Around the dent, the bronze shows a subtle bloom of lighter color where the metal has been stressed, a pale golden halo that tells you how far the impact spread from the center of the blow. You carry the helmet across to the anvil, where the rounded stake is already slotted into the hardy hole, its smooth, bent surface rising like a polished stone. The stake is the right shape for this work. Its curve matches the inner contour of a cheek guard almost exactly, a fit that has been refined over years of tapping countless dents from countless helmets, until the iron has learned its purpose by heart. You lower the helmet over the stake, fitting the hollow of the cheek guard onto the curved horn so that the dent sits directly over the highest point of the iron. The rest of the helmet hangs in the air around the stake, the bowl of the skull unsupported and tilting gently toward you, and you steady it with your left hand curled inside the neck opening, fingers spread against the padded leather liner. The liner gives under your touch with a soft, dry compression, the old wool fibers yielding without sound. With your right hand you pick up the planishing hammer, the smallest of the three you had laid out, its domed face polished to a mirror by years of light taps on soft metal. The handle is ash wood, smooth and darkened where your grip always falls, and you settle it into your palm, not with a tight clench, but with the loose, controlled hold of a man who has held a hammer for more hours than he has not. You let the weight of the hammerhead rest against your fingers, testing the balance, and then you bring it over the dent and pause. The pause is not hesitation. It is the moment when your eye measures the metal, your hand remembers the 1,000 previous dents, and your ear anticipates the sound it will make. Then you tap. The first tap is light, almost a question. The hammer face connects with the bronze just at the edge of the dent where the metal begins to rise, and the sound is a small, clear ring that hangs in the quiet air for a fraction of a second before it dies away. You lift the hammer barely an inch and tap again. A second time, the face landing a hair's breadth to the left of the first mark, and the ring repeats, identical but distinct, like a drop of water falling into a still basin. You begin a slow rhythm now. Tap and lift, each stroke so gentle that the hammer seems to bounce away from the metal of its own accord, your wrist doing all the work while your elbow and shoulder remain still. The bronze responds with tiny movements that your fingers feel through the leather liner, a microscopic give as the dent begins its long journey back toward the original curve. You work outward from the edge of the depression, moving the hammer in a spiral that unwinds from the rim of the dent toward its center. Each tap overlaps the previous one by half the width of the hammer face so that no spot is struck twice with the same force at the same angle, and the bronze yields in a controlled, even flow. The sound of the work fills the smithy with a quiet, steady percussion, a series of soft ringing notes that have no pattern, a musician would recognize but that your own breathing has already fallen into step with. The hammer rises and falls. The metal pings, the anvil absorbs the deeper vibrations through the stake, and the whole room seems to thrum with a low, contented frequency that you feel more in your chest than in your ears. Outside, the occasional sound of the fort no longer reaches you. Your attention has drawn inward to the small circle of bronze beneath your hand, and the world beyond that circle has become a blur of light and shadow. After a while, you stop and lift the helmet from the stake, turning it so the light can show you the progress. The dent has grown shallower, its deepest point now only a faint depression rather than a clear hollow, and the stressed halo around it has begun to fade as the metal relaxes back into its old shape. You run the ball of your thumb over the surface and feel the slight residual unevenness, a mild wave rather than a sharp dish, and you nod because this is exactly what you expected. Cold planishing can only take a dent so far. Beyond this point, the bronze needs a little heat to soften and release the last of its tension, or the metal will work harden and risk cracking under further hammering. You set the helmet aside on the bench, the cheek guard facing up, and walk to the forge. The coals have settled lower while you worked, their bright orange fading to a deeper garnet red crusted here and there with grey ash. You take the rake and pull fresh fuel in from the edges, mounding it over the hot coal, and then you work the bellows in a series of long, slow strokes that wake the fire back to a full glow. The air hisses through the tire and the charcoal answers with a sudden brightening, small flames licking up between the nuggets, the heat pushing outward in a wave that warms your face and forearms. You do not need a roaring furnace for this task. A gentle, even heat is better. So you pump the bellows only until the coals show a uniform cherry color. And then you let the lever rest, the fire breathing on its own again with a soft, continuous rustle that sounds like wind through dry leaves. You take a pair of medium tongs from the rack, their jaws lined with copper to prevent marking the bronze, and you carry the helmet to the forge. Holding it by the neck flange, you lower the cheek guard into the heat, positioning it just above the coals rather than burying it within them, because bronze melts at a lower temperature than iron, and you want it softened, not ruined. The metal begins to warm almost at once, the golden color deepening to a richer, redder hue, and you turn the helmet slowly, tilting it so the heat reaches every part of the dented area in an even wash. The smell of warm bronze rises around you, faintly sweet and metallic, different from the sharper smell of hot iron. You watch the color of the metal closely, waiting for the moment when it shifts from a dull reddish glow to the faintest amber, a shade that tells you the bronze has reached the right temperature for final shaping. When that moment comes, you withdraw the helmet smoothly from the heat and carry it back to the anvil, the air around the cheek guard shimmering ever so slightly. You place the helmet over the stake once more, the heated bronze settling onto the curved iron with a soft hiss as the cooler stake draws a little warmth from the metal. The planishing hammer is still waiting where you left it on the bench, and you pick it up and resume your slow, careful tapping while the bronze holds its newfound softness. The sound has changed slightly now. The ring is duller, more of a thud than a ping, because the heated metal absorbs more of the impact and reflects less back into the air. You work from the same spiral pattern, moving outward from the deepest point that is no longer deep at all, and the bronze flows under the hammer with a pliability that feels almost like wet clay. Each tap pushes the last stubborn atoms of the dent back into line with the surrounding surface, and within a short span of minutes the irregularity has vanished entirely. The cheek guard once again a smooth, continuous sweep from the temple to the jaw. You lift the helmet from the stake a final time, and hold it up to the window light. The curve is true. No shadow catches where the dent had been, and the reflection of the windowsill now runs straight across the surface without a single wobble. The stressed halo is completely gone, and the color of the bronze has returned to its natural honeyed tone as the heat dissipates into the air. You lay the hammer down with a soft clack on the bench and step to the quenching bucket, the tall clay jar of water with its faint oil slick on the surface. Using the tongs, you lower the still warm cheek guard into the water with a smooth, unhurried motion. The water hisses quietly, a sound like a long exhale, and a thin curl of steam rises and vanishes. You hold the helmet under for a count of 10, feeling the faint vibration of the cooling bronze through the tong handles, and then you lift it out. Droplets of water cling to the metal, beading up and running down in slow rivulets, and you shake the helmet gently once, twice, scattering the drops across the packed earth floor where they disappear into dark small spots. Now comes the finishing. The planishing has left the surface of the cheek guard faintly textured, with 1,000 microscopic hammer marks, a texture that you can feel more than see, a slight graininess under your fingers. To remove this, you take a square of fine sandstone from the shelf under the bench, its surface worn smooth on one side and slightly rough on the other. You dip the rough side into the quenching water to wet it, then begin rubbing it gently over the repaired area in small circles that slowly grow larger. The sand leaves behind a thin, milky paste that fills the tiny hollows between the hammer marks and begins to level them out. You work the stone in overlapping circuits, your hand moving at a steady, patient pace that has nothing to do with speed and everything to do with thoroughness. And gradually the graininess fades and the surface begins to regain its original polish. The sound of the rubbing is a soft, sandy whisper, a sound so quiet that you can hear your own breathing behind it, and the distant, almost imaginary hum of the forge. When the sandstone work is done, you set the stone aside and take up a scrap of oiled leather from the pile near the whetstone area. The leather is a palm-sized piece that has been soaked in olive oil and left to cure until it has taken on the color of rich dark earth, and it is impregnated with the fine dust of pumice powder from many previous polishings. You fold the leather over your first 2 fingers and begin to burnish the cheek guard with long sweeping strokes, rubbing from the temple curve down to the jaw edge and back again, over and over. The oiled leather glides across the bronze with a sensation that is both smooth and slightly grippy, and as you work, the metal begins to glow with a deep, liquid luster that reflects the window light in a single, unbroken sheen. The repaired area blends into the rest of the helmet until no eye could ever tell where the dent had been. The bronze now one seamless surface from brow guard to neck flange. You hold the helmet out at arm's length and turn it slowly, checking your work from every angle. The light slides across the cheek guard without catching or distorting, and the color is uniform from edge to edge, a warm bronze tone with just the faintest hint of rose in its depths. The leather liner inside is still sound, the rivets tight, and the iron ring at the crown waits empty for the crest that may or may not be attached later. You set the helmet back on the left side of the bench where it had waited since the morning, but now it sits differently. It no longer holds its damage like a question asked, but rests quiet and whole, ready for its return to the Legion stores. You stretch your fingers now, noticing for the first time the slight ache in the knuckles from the hammer grip, a small familiar sensation that you have felt at this same hour on 100 other days. You look up toward the window and see that the sun has climbed noticeably higher, the rectangle of light on the floor having traveled a hand's width across the packed earth. A slight breeze moves through the open door, stirring the smell of charcoal and quenching oil and carrying it out into the lane, and you hear the distant clang of another smith's hammer from somewhere further down the row of workshops, a sound that matches your own rhythm so closely it might as well be an echo. You pour a little fresh water from the jug into your cup, drink it in 2 slow swallows that cool the back of your throat, and then you set the cup down and turn your attention to the next piece waiting on the bench, the cracked iron greave that rests beside the helmet. Its dark grey surface patient and still. With the helmet now resting whole and gleaming on the left side of the bench, you allow yourself a brief moment of stillness while your hands remember the shape of the finished work. The bronze glows softly in the widening light, its surface so smooth that the high window reflects in it as a pale smear, and the satisfaction of the repair is not a sharp feeling, but a quiet settling, as though a small weight has been lifted that you had forgotten you were carrying. You flex your fingers once, twice, feeling the warmth of the hammer grip fade from the joints, and then you wipe your palms on the rag tucked into your leather apron and let your gaze travel along the bench to see what small task might naturally follow the larger one. Your eyes land on the copper water vessel sitting beside the quenching bucket. It is a simple bowl, broad and shallow, its rim slightly uneven from years of being lifted and set down. Its inner surface stained a deep greenish brown where water and minerals have left their slow trace. You use this bowl every day to top up the quenching bucket, or to carry water for cooling a small piece of work, and you had noticed earlier, while filling the bucket, that the handle had loosened. The handle is a curved strip of bronze attached to the bowl by 2 small lugs, and the rear lug now wiggles when you lift the bowl, the solder joint having cracked after countless cycles of heating and cooling. It is not an urgent repair because the bowl still holds water, but the looseness will only grow worse if left unattended, and the work will take only a short while, a small interlude between the helmet and the heavier tasks ahead. You lift the bowl from its spot and turn it over in your hands. The bottom is slightly dented from sitting on the packed earth floor, and the handle lugs are simple loops of bronze that have been soldered directly to the copper with a soft tin lead mix. The rear lug shifts under your thumb with a faint gritty sensation, and when you hold it up to the light, you can see the hairline crack in the silver-colored solder that circles the base of the lug like a ring of frost. The front lug is still sound, and the handle itself is sturdy, its curve darkened by the touch of many fingers. You carry the bowl to the bench, clear a small space beside the helmet, and set it down with the loose lug facing upward so you can work on it without straining your neck. The tools you need are few. From the shelf under the bench you retrieve a small clay crucible, no larger than a hen's egg, in which you keep your supply of soft solder already mixed with powdered borax flux. You take down the tiny oil lamp that hangs from a hook on the wall near the tool rack, a simple terracotta lamp with a thick wick and a shallow reservoir of olive oil, and you light it with a spill of kindling from the forge, the flame catching with a soft yellow flicker that steadies into a neat teardrop shape. You set the lamp on the bench and slide a small iron stand over it, a tripod of bent wire that holds the bowl at just the right height above the heat. The only other tool is a narrow iron spatula with a pointed tip, used for picking up a pellet of solder and delivering it to the joint without waste. You settle onto the stool and position the bowl on the stand so the loose lug hangs directly over the lamp flame. The distance is small, perhaps the width of your thumb, so the heat will concentrate on the joint without spreading too far into the copper and discoloring it. You dip the pointed spatula into the crucible and lift out a single bead of solder, a tiny silver-grey sphere that catches the lamplight, and you lay it carefully on the cracked joint, nestling it against the base of the lug. The borax mixed into the solder will melt first and clean the metal surfaces, and then the tin and lead will follow, flowing into the crack by capillary action if the heat is steady and patient. You lean close, your forearms resting on the bench, and watch the lamp flame play against the copper. The warmth reaches the lug first, and you see the faintest shimmer as the residual moisture in the air around the metal evaporates. Then the borax begins to melt, with a tiny fizzle, a sound so faint it is more a sensation in your eardrum than a true noise, and the flux spreads across the joint in a glassy, transparent film that follows the crack like water seeking a channel. The solder pellet holds its shape for a few slow breaths, a tiny silver island, and then its edges soften and the whole bead collapses into a liquid mirror that flows instantly into the gap. The soda wicks around the base of the lug in a smooth, quick motion, a line of silver that races along the joint and then stops, cooling instantly at the boundary where the heat is not enough to keep it liquid. You lift the bowl carefully away from the lamp and hold it still while the solder sets, the bright silver dulling to a matte grey in the space of 3 heartbeats. The lug is now firm, immovable, and the handle rings with a single solid note when you tap it with a fingernail. You set the bowl aside to cool completely and pinch out the lamp flame with a damp thumb and forefinger, a tiny hiss of smoke rising and vanishing. The whole repair has taken no more time than it takes to tell it, but the smallness of the task is itself a kind of rest. Your hands have done something simple and complete, and the bowl is ready to serve again, its handle now as tight as the day it was first soldered. You wipe the spatula clean on the oily rag and return it to its place, then pour a ladle full of fresh water into the bowl from the jug to test the repair. The water sits calm and still, no bead of moisture appearing at the joint, and you pour the water into the quenching bucket where it joins the larger volume with a soft musical splash that echoes once against the walls and fades. You lift your cup from its spot on the corner of the bench, a small beaker of coarse red pottery with a chipped rim, and fill it from the jug. The water is cool and faintly tasting of the clay, and you drink it in slow, measured swallows while standing by the open door. The mid-morning has fully arrived, and the light that pours through the doorway is a clean, strong gold that warms the top of your head and shoulders. You step out of the shadow and lean against the doorframe, letting the sun touch your face. The lane outside is quiet, but not empty. Across the way, the fuller's workshop door is open, and you can see the fuller himself, standing knee-deep in a stone vat, trading a length of woolen cloth with a slow, rhythmic stepping motion, his hands braced on the sides. The smell of fuller's earth and stale urine drifts across the lane, not unpleasant in the open air, but earthy and slightly sharp, a working smell that you have known since childhood. A little further down, a potter is stacking newly thrown bowls on the drying rack, the wet clay a deep orange-brown, and he works with the same unhurried economy that you recognize in your own hands. A dog, a lean brown animal with one white ear, trots past the doorway without glancing at you and disappears around the corner of the granary. The sky above the rooftops is a pale, cloudless blue that will deepen to a richer shade by afternoon. You finish the water and set the cup on the stool just inside the door, then step back to the bench because the day is long and there is no reason to rush. The mention of food had not been present in your thoughts, but the sight of the baker's boy passing the lane with a flat basket of round loaves reminds your stomach that the morning bread has long since been digested. You take a scrap of the same barley bread from your morning meal, wrapped in a clean cloth and tucked on the shelf beneath the workbench, and you break off a piece. The bread is drier now, a little harder at the edges, but it still tastes of the oven's mild char and the slight nuttiness of the barley flour. You chew it slowly, your jaw working in a lazy circle, and you let your eyes rest on the row of tools hanging from their pegs without truly looking at them. The pause is not a break from work so much as a different kind of work, the work of letting the body settle, of letting the mind drift across the surface of things without diving. Your gaze travels to the forge, where the coals have once again dimmed to a low ruby shimmer under a thin crust of grey ash. The fire will need fresh fuel before you begin the greave repair, but that is still a little way off, and for now, the low heat is enough to keep the workshop comfortable. The chimney draws steadily, a faint column of warmed air that pulls the last traces of oil lamp smoke and solder flux out of the room, and the fresh air that replaces it carries the faint sweetness of clover from the patch of grass near the aqueduct. You lean against the bench and let the quiet of the workshop settle around you like a familiar blanket. Not heavy, but reassuring. The kind of quiet that is made of many small, continuous sounds rather than true silence. The hum of the forge, the occasional crackle of settling coals, the distant tread of the fuller in his vat, the coo of a pigeon on the roof. It occurs to you in this idle moment that the armor on the bench has its own quiet presence. The helmet you have just repaired seems almost to breathe with the satisfaction of its restored shape. The greave still waits with its patient crack, the segmentata plates still sit in their neat stack, the chainmail lies folded like a sleeping animal, and the gladius gleams dully along its blunted edge. Each piece has a history that you do not need to know, a story of marches and drills and perhaps a skirmish. But in your workshop they are simply objects in need of care, and you are the one who gives it. The thought passes through your mind without attaching itself to any strong emotion. It is simply a fact, like the color of the sky or the weight of the hammer. You straighten up and walk to the back corner of the smithy where a small wooden chest holds your supply of consumable materials. The chest is made of cedar, its wood still faintly aromatic after all this time, and its lid lifts with a squeak of iron hinges. Inside, rolls of leather, coils of wire, lumps of beeswax, and small clay pots of various powders are arranged in compartments. You take out a roll of thin ox leather, the piece you had set aside for the segmentata straps, and you lay it on the bench near the stack of plates, so it will be ready when the time comes. You also check the coil of iron wire for the chainmail repair, unrolling a short length and examining it for rust or scale. The wire is clean and sound, and you coil it back up, with a few neat turns around your fingers before setting it beside the pliers. The small actions of preparation feel good in your hands, a way of remaining in the rhythm of the day without yet engaging in the heavier tasks. The water vessel, now cool and repaired, you lift and return to its spot beside the quenching bucket. You pour a final splash of water into it from the jug, more for the pleasure of seeing it hold than from any need, and you watch the surface of the water tremble and then grow still. The bowl will serve many more days, and the small repair will hold for years if it is not abused. You dry your hands on the rag and take up a different position at the bench, standing now rather than sitting, so that you can stretch your back and look down on the greave that waits next in the line of work. The iron greave is still lying with its concave inner face turned down, the hairline crack visible as a thin dark thread that interrupts the otherwise uniform dark grey surface. You pick it up and feel its weight, heavier than the helmet by a good margin, because iron is denser than bronze and the greave is forged from a single thick blank. The crack runs from the upper curve near the knee area down toward the ankle flare, following a slightly wavy path that suggests the metal had been stressed along a line of slight impurity. You press the edges of the crack very gently with your thumbs, testing the give, and the metal does not move. The crack has not yet spread into a full separation, and the greave would probably survive another drill session if it had to, but you would rather repair it now than wait for it to fail. The low-carbon iron patch you had cut last week is still on the shelf, a thin strip about the length of your hand and the width of 2 fingers, its edges beveled to allow a smooth weld. You fetch it and lay it over the crack, aligning it so it covers the full length of the split with a margin at both ends, and the patch fits well, its curve matching the greave's contour closely enough that only a little hammer adjustment will be needed. You set the greave and the patch aside together and turn to the forge. The fire has dimmed to a point where it will need a careful rebuild before it can deliver the welding heat required for ironwork. You take the rake, pull the remaining hot coals into a tight central mound, and add several handfuls of fresh charcoal nuggets all around the perimeter, building a low dome of fuel that slopes up from the edges to the glowing center. Then you work the bellows with a slow, deep rhythm, your arm moving up and down in a steady arc, and the fire responds by sending thin tongues of orange flame licking through the new charcoal. The sound of the bellows is the same soft wheeze and sigh that had accompanied the early morning, and the warmth blooms outward from the hearth, spreading across your face and chest in a wave that is not yet hot but comfortably strong. You continue pumping until the mound of charcoal is all caught, the entire forge bed now a uniform cherry color, with brighter yellow patches where the air blast concentrates, and then you let the lever rest so the fire can settle into itself while you bring the greave to the bench for the final preparations before welding. The moment before a welding heat always carries a particular kind of stillness. The fire is ready, the metal is prepared, The borax jar is open, and the tongs are within reach. You stand for a few breaths with the greave in your hands, feeling the cool weight of it, and you look around the workshop one more time, just to fix the picture in your mind. The helmet gleaming on the bench, the copper vessel solid and whole, the tools in their ranks, and the rectangle of sun now centered on the packed earth floor. The day is progressing in its quiet, inevitable way, and you are exactly where you should be, neither ahead nor behind, simply present in the long, gentle flow of the hours. The forge breathes in its steady way, while you lift the cracked greave and the small iron patch from the bench, holding them for a moment just to feel the difference in their temperatures. The greave is cool and heavy, its dark grey surface smooth, except for the fine dark line that interrupts it, while the patch is a fresh strip of low-carbon iron with a slightly rough texture from having been cut cold with a chisel, and then filed to a bevel along both long edges. You turn the patch over and see the faint marks of the file, parallel scratches that catch the light like the grain in a piece of old wood. And you remind yourself that these bevels will give the weld a channel to fill, a tiny valley for the molten iron to flow into when you bring the hammer down. You carry both pieces across to the forge, stepping carefully around the anvil block, and lay the greave flat on the fire brick lip that runs along the front of the hearth so the metal can begin to warm slowly before you commit it to the deeper heat. While the greave drinks in the first gentle warmth from the edge of the fire, you pull the medium tongs from the rack and test their grip on the greave's ankle flare, the narrowest part where the tong jaws can hold without interfering with the crack area. The copper-lined jaws close firmly with a soft, solid click, and you lift the greave slightly, satisfying yourself that the hold is secure and that the piece will not twist out of alignment when the time comes to bury it in the coals. You also take a moment to open the clay jar of borax flux that you had set on the bench earlier, dipping a narrow iron spoon into the white powder and setting a small mound of it on a flat fire brick near the forge so it is ready when the welding moment arrives. The powder is a soft, chalky white, and a few grains drift onto the fire brick like the very beginning of a snowfall, settling without sound. Now you lift the greave with the tongs and bring it into the forge proper, sliding it into the mound of glowing charcoal with the cracked side facing downward, so the heat reaches the damaged area first and most directly. The charcoal shifts around the iron with a series of soft, tinkling sounds, and a few sparks rise in a lazy spiral as the fuel adjusts to the new weight. You hold the tongs with a relaxed grip, your left hand resting on the bellows lever, and you pump gently, sending a steady stream of air through the tire. The coals brighten at once, the orange deepening into a cherry color that spreads across the surface of the greave in slow, uneven waves, and you watch the metal begin its journey toward the heat it needs. The smell of hot iron, a clean, sharp scent that has a hint of something almost sweet at its edges, fills the air around the forge and settles into the fabric of your tunic. You turn the greave every little while, rotating it inside the fire so that the heat penetrates evenly from the knee curve down to the ankle. The crack, which had been a dark line against grey, now begins to glow more brightly than the surrounding metal as the firelight finds the tiny gap and illuminates it from within. You watch the color of the iron change through the familiar progression. First a dull red, barely visible in the daylight, then a brighter red that deepens toward orange, and finally the full cherry glow that tells you the metal has reached a working heat. At this stage, the iron is not yet at welding temperature, but you are not yet ready to weld. You need first to soften the metal and draw out any brittleness that has accumulated from the original forging and from the stress that caused the crack, and so you hold the greave at the cherry heat for a slow count of 30, letting the warmth soak into every crystal and grain, and then you withdraw it smoothly from the coals and carry it, not to the anvil, but to the large clay pot filled with dry sand that sits in the corner of the workshop near the water barrel. The sandpot is a broad, deep vessel that you keep for exactly this purpose. Its contents are fine river sand that you have sifted many times and baked in the forge on a scrap iron plate to remove any last trace of moisture. When you bury hot metal in dry sand, the warmth escapes very slowly, far more slowly than it would in air or water, and the gradual cooling lets the iron relax its internal tensions, makes it softer and less likely to crack again when you apply the hammer. You lower the glowing greave into the sand, laying it flat and pushing it down gently with the tongs so the fine grains close over it, first covering the edges and then the whole piece in a smooth mound that turns slightly darker where the heat touches it. A faint, dry, earthy smell rises from the sand as the iron warms it, not unlike the smell of a sun-heated stone pathway, and you pat the mound flat with the back of a firebrick and leave it to wait. The sand will do its work without any further help from you, and the greave will cool over the next stretch of the morning until it is cool enough to touch with bare hands. This waiting is not idleness. It is a part of the repair as essential as the hammering will be, and you accept it with the same calm patience that you've brought to every other step of the day. You wipe the tongs clean with the rag and hang them back on their hook, then step away from the forge in the sand pot to let the quiet return. Your cup still holds a little water from earlier, and you finish it in one swallow, the liquid now room temperature and tasting faintly of clay. You refill the cup from the jug and set it back on the stool near the door, then take up your spot at the bench to wait and to tidy. The helmet you repaired earlier gleams at you from the far left, and you lift it once more simply to appreciate the smoothness of the cheek guard, running your thumb over the place where the dent had been, and feeling no trace of the old damage. You set it down again with a soft, pleased sound that is not quite a word, and then you turn your attention to the segmentata plates stacked in the center of the bench. Not to begin work on them yet, but to check that everything you will need is still in its place. The roll of ox leather, the sharp awl, the knife for cutting straps, and the spool of waxed linen thread are all where you left them, and you adjust the position of the awl very slightly, so its point is not near your elbow, a small adjustment born of habit. Time passes in the workshop with that peculiar, gentle slowness that comes when you are waiting for heat to fade. The rectangle of sun on the floor has lengthened and now touches the foot of the anvil block, illuminating the rough texture of the oaken stump and the tiny flecks of iron scale that have gathered in its crevices over many months. You watch a single dust mote drift down through the light and land on the anvil face, and you think nothing in particular about it, only that it is there and then it is not. The pigeon on the roof coos again, a soft, throaty sound that seems to swell and recede without urgency, and the fuller in the workshop across the lane has finished treading his cloth and is now hanging wet lengths of fabric over a wooden rack to dry, their dripping making a faint, irregular patter on the stones. The day is alive around you, but it is alive in the way of a slow, deep breath, and you are content to be one part of that breathing. After a span of time that you do not measure by any clock, you walk to the corner and test the sand with the back of your hand. The surface of the sand is now barely warmer than the air, and when you push your fingers down into the mound you feel the greave beneath, its temperature having fallen to a point where you can lift it out with bare fingers without the slightest discomfort. You brush the sand away gently, lifting the greave free and shaking the last few grains from its inner curve. The metal has taken on a dark, matte finish from the slow cooling, almost a charcoal black, and the crack is still visible but now seems somehow more settled, as if the iron itself has accepted the damage and is ready to be mended. You carry the greave to the anvil and lay it across the flat face, the cracked side facing upward, and you position the low-carbon iron patch over the split, aligning the beveled edges so they sit flush against the greave surface with a narrow channel between them for the weld. Now you prepare for the welding heat. You take the bellows lever and pump with a deeper, steadier rhythm than before, your whole arm moving from the shoulder, and the fire responds by roaring up with a brightness that shifts from cherry to a hot yellow-orange. The heat coming off the forge intensifies until you feel it on your forehead and the bridge of your nose, a firm pressure of warmth that makes you squint slightly against the glare. You add a handful of fresh charcoal to the mound, waiting until the new fuel is caught and the entire bed is a uniform blazing color, and then you lift the tongs again and grasp the greave by the ankle, the patch held loosely in place by a small clamp made of bent iron wire that you had prepared earlier and left on the anvil step. The clamp is nothing more than a piece of wire bent into a U-shape that presses the patch down just firmly enough to stop it from shifting, and it will be removed once the first hammer blows have joined the metals. You slide the greave and patch together into the brightest part of the forge, the very heart of the fire where the air blast concentrates and the temperature is highest. The charcoal around them glows with a near-white incandescence, and you watch through narrowed eyes as the iron begins to heat through its color spectrum once more, moving past cherry red, past bright orange, and into the pale yellow range, where the surface of the metal takes on a slick, almost wet appearance. You are watching not just for color, but for the subtle sign that tells you the iron is ready to weld. A slight shimmering of the surface, as if the metal has just begun to sweat. The borax flux will help this moment, and as soon as you see the shimmer, you withdraw the greave partway from the fire, sprinkle a pinch of the white powder from the mound on the fire brick, directly along the seam between the patch and the greave, and then push the piece back into the heat for a final count of 5. The borax melts instantly, fusing into a glassy, transparent coating that seals the joint from the air and dissolves any last traces of oxide, and the shimmer intensifies until the surfaces of both the patch and the greave look like they are covered in a thin film of liquid light. You lift the assembly from the fire with a smooth, unhurried motion and carry it the few steps to the anvil, the hot metal throwing off a wave of heat that you can feel on your cheeks and the backs of your hands. The wire clamp you flick away with the tip of a small poker, and then you pick up the cross-peen hammer, the one with the wedge-shaped face, and you bring it down on the patch with a quick, light stroke. The hammer blow lands, and the sound is a flat, solid thud rather than a ring, because the hot iron is soft and absorbs most of the vibration. You lift the hammer and strike again. Immediately, the second blow overlapping the first by half the width of the hammer face, and then a third and a fourth, working along the length of the patch from the knee end toward the ankle in a rapid, even rhythm that sounds like a muffled drumbeat. Each stroke pushes the soft, near-molten surfaces together, forcing the iron of the patch and the iron of the greave to merge at the molecular level. The borax flux squeezing out of the joint in tiny glassy beads that fly off and cool into brittle black specks on the anvil face. You work the weld in a single pass, moving steadily along the seam, and by the time you reach the far end of the patch, the whole joint has been homogeneously bonded. The patch and the greave, now one piece of metal rather than two. You lift the hammer away and set it down on the anvil step, and you take a moment to let your breathing settle. The weld area still glows a dull red, darkening as you watch, and the line of the joint is marked by a slight ridge of displaced metal that will need to be filed smooth. But the crack itself is gone, sealed beneath the patch, and the greave is once again a single solid structure, its strength restored. You lift the greave with the tongs and carry it to the bench, laying it on a flat section of the wooden surface where it can continue to cool without touching anything that might mark the hot metal. The smell of the borax and the heated iron hangs in the air, a clean, slightly acrid scent that will dissipate as the workshop air circulates, and you open the door a little wider to invite a fresh breeze in from the lane. While the greave cools from red to black to its natural dark grey, you take up the coarse file, the flat bastard with the worn handle, and you run your thumb across its teeth to check that they are free of clogged metal. The file is in good condition, its cutting surface still sharp, and you set it on the bench beside the cooling greave along with a finer file for the finishing passes and a square of emery cloth that you will use for the final polish. You also fill a small cup with water from the quenching bucket and dip a rag into it, so you can wipe away the filing dust as you work, the damp rag darkening as it soaks up the water and cooling your fingers pleasantly. When the greave is cool enough that you can press your palm flat against the weld area without flinching, you pick it up and settle it on your lap, sitting on the stool with your back against the bench edge. You position the file at the knee end of the weld and begin to draw it across the ridge of displaced metal in long, steady strokes that push forward and lift back, forward and lift back. The file teeth biting into the soft iron with a crisp, gritty sound that is half scrape and half whisper. Tiny curls of iron peel away from the weld seam, dark and fine as pencil shavings, and fall onto the leather apron stretched across your thighs. You work the file along the full length of the patch, first one side of the weld and then the other, reducing the ridge until the surface of the patch blends smoothly into the surrounding curve of the greave. The sound of the filing is a constant, dry rhythm that fills the workshop and seems to sync with the distant, almost inaudible pulse of the aqueduct overflow, a quiet backdrop that your ears accept and then forget. After the coarse file has done its primary shaping, you switch to the finer file, a smooth cut tool that leaves behind a surface almost ready for polishing. The finer file sings with a higher, softer note, a sound like paper being drawn across stone, and you use lighter pressure now, letting the tool do its own work without forcing it. Your hand moves back and forth, the motion growing so automatic that your mind begins to drift again, not into sleep, but into that pleasant state of awareness where the body works and the mind floats, untethered and peaceful. You think of nothing in particular, or perhaps you think of the coolness of the morning when you first lit the forge, or the way the water hissed when you quenched the bronze helmet, or the taste of the barley bread earlier. But the thoughts do not stick. They pass through like the dust motes in the window light, visible one moment and gone the next. When the file work is done, you take up the square of emery cloth, a fabric-backed abrasive that is dark grey and slightly flexible, and you fold it into a pad that fits neatly in your palm. You dip a corner of the cloth into the cup of water you had prepared, and then you begin to rub the weld area in small circles that grow steadily larger, polishing the patched surface until it matches the sheen of the surrounding metal. The emery cloth leaves behind a satin finish, smooth but not mirror bright, a working finish that is appropriate for armor that will see field use. You wipe the area clean with the damp rag and hold the greave up in the light from the high window, sighting along its length. The repair is invisible except for the very faintest line where the patch edges meet the greave, a line so fine that it could be mistaken for a scratch or a natural mark in the iron. The curve is true, the surface is smooth, and the weight of the greave in your hand feels balanced and whole. The last step is to check the fit. You carry the greave to the wooden leg-shaped form that stands in the corner near the anvil, a solid pine block that has been carved and sanded into the approximate shape of a man's lower leg from below the knee to the ankle. The form is dark with oil and age, and its surface bears the faint impressions of many greaves having been pressed against it. You lift the repaired greave and place it over the form, guiding the curve onto the wooden calf and pressing gently until the metal sits flush against the wood from top to bottom. The fit is good, the patch does not throw off the contour, and the buckles on the back align neatly with the leather straps that are still attached. You fasten the buckles one at a time, drawing the straps snug but not tight, and you step back to look at the greave as it would appear on a soldier's leg. It stands there solid and ready, the once cracked shin guard now as strong as the day it left the original forge, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a repair done correctly, a satisfaction that is not loud or proud, but as steady and low as the hum of the fire. You unbuckle the straps and lift the greave from the form, returning it to the bench where you lay it beside the helmet. The two repaired pieces now sit together, the bronze and the iron, their damages erased by the morning's slow and patient work. You pour yourself another cup of water from the jug, drink it in a series of small swallows, and then you roll your shoulders to loosen the slight stiffness that has gathered between your shoulder blades from bending over the anvil and the bench. The day is not yet half done, and there are plates to re-leather and mail to mend and a sword to sharpen. But the rhythm of the workshop has taken you fully into its current now, and you move within it without resistance, carried forward into the next task as naturally as the sun climbs the pale blue sky. With the greave now whole and resting beside the bronze helmet, you turn your attention to the stack of segmentata plates that has waited in the center of the bench through all the earlier work. There are 8 plates in the stack, each one a curved rectangle of iron roughly the length of your forearm and the width of your hand. Their surface is dark with a thin bloom of rust and old oil that has dried to a gummy brown film. The plates are still separated by squares of coarse sacking, a precaution you took when you first lifted the pile and found that the leather straps had grown so brittle they might snap if the plates were allowed to rub directly against one another. You remove the sacking pieces one at a time, dropping them into a loose heap at the far corner of the bench, and then you fan the plates out side by side so you can see them all together. 8 curved iron tiles laid in a neat overlapping row. The metal of the plates is in fundamentally good condition. You can tell this at a glance because the edges are still straight and free of deep rust pitting, and the convex outer faces retain the gentle sheen of the forge scale that was never fully polished away. The inner faces, the concave sides where the leather straps once held everything together, are the ones that need the most attention. There, the rust has crept in more boldly, encouraged by the sweat and moisture that accumulated between the metal and the leather over many marches. The iron is speckled with a fine reddish-brown powder that comes off on your fingers when you touch it, and in a few small patches the rust has deepened into dark, rough spots that will need a thorough scouring. The brass loops riveted to the inside of each plate, through which the leather straps will eventually pass, are tarnished to a dull greenish brown, but are still firmly attached, except for the one on the fourth plate that you had noticed earlier. Its rivet slightly loose and in need of recinching. Before you can clean the plates or cut new leather, you must first remove the remains of the old strapping. You take up the sharp knife that has been lying on the bench near the awl, a small blade with a thin point and a handle of oiled beech wood that fits into the hollow of your hand like a river-washed stone. The knife is sharp enough to shave the hair from your forearm, and you test this lightly before you begin, satisfied with the way the edge catches the light. You pick up the first plate and turn it over, examining the leather straps that remain. They are dry beyond saving, the vegetable tanned oxhide having lost all its natural give and turned into a material that resembles dark, cracked bark. Where the straps fold through the brass loops, they have snapped cleanly on 2 of the 3 attachment points, leaving only short, stiff stubs. The leftover fragments are held in place as much by habit as by any real tension. You slip the point of the knife under the edge of one of the stubs and lift gently, working the blade side to side in very small movements so that the leather begins to peel away from the iron without gouging the metal beneath. The sound is a soft, dry crackling, like twigs snapping under a distant foot, and tiny flakes of old leather shower down onto the bench in a fine dark dust that smells faintly of ancient sweat and tannin. You free the first strap entirely after a few careful passes of the knife, the old leather coming away in 2 pieces that you drop into the scrap bucket under the bench. The second strap on the same plate proves more stubborn because a fragment of the original stitching has hardened into a small rock-like knot around the brass loop, and you spend a little longer picking at it with the knife point until the knot crumbles and the loop stands clear. The third strap is already gone except for a thin smear of leather residue that clings to the iron, and you scrape this away with the flat of the blade, revealing the dull grey metal beneath. You set the first plate aside and reach for the second, and then the third, working your way steadily through the stack. The knife work is quiet and repetitive, the sequence of lifting, peeling, scraping, and brushing away debris that your hands perform without any need for conscious thought. By the time you have freed all 8 plates from their old leather, a small mound of brittle fragments has gathered in the scrap bucket, and the bench is littered with dark crumbs that you sweep into your cut palm and drop onto the pile. Now the plates are bare, every brass loop exposed and every surface ready for cleaning. You fetch the wire brush from its nail near the forge, a stubby wooden handle set with a block of stiff steel bristles that have been worn down to an even length by years of scrubbing. Alongside the brush, you take a small clay bowl and pour into it a generous splash of vinegar from the narrow-necked bottle that sits on the corner shelf. The vinegar, a cheap, sharp-smelling variety made from soured wine. To the vinegar, you add a spoonful of fine river sand scooped from a linen bag, stirring the mixture with the handle of the brush until it forms a thin, gritty paste. The smell of the vinegar cuts through the workshop's usual blend of charcoal and oil, sharp and clean, and it stings the inside of your nose pleasantly as you carry the bowl to the bench. You dip the wire brush into the paste and begin to scrub the first plate, working on the inner face where the rust is thickest. The bristles bite into the corrosion with a steady, scratchy sound, somewhere between a hiss and a rasp, and the vinegar paste darkens as it lifts the rust away. You scrub in small circles, overlapping each pass by half the width of the brush head, and the iron gradually lightens from a dull brownish grey to a cleaner, darker silver. The sand in the paste provides just enough abrasion to loosen the stubborn spots without leaving deep scratches, and the vinegar helps to dissolve the rust that the bristles cannot reach. You wipe the plate clean with a damp rag, inspect it, find a small patch that still shows a trace of orange, and scrub that spot again until it yields. Then you set the plate on a clean section of the bench and move to the second. The scrubbing work continues through all 8 plates, and with each one the rhythm becomes more settled. The wire brush travels in its small circles, the vinegar scent fills your breathing, the bench grows damp with splashes of dark liquid, and your fingers begin to prune slightly from the moisture. You pause once to pour a fresh splash of vinegar into the bowl and add more sand, the grit having worn smooth and the liquid having thickened with rust particles, and then you resume. The sound of the wire brush is monotonous and steady, a sound that would be harsh if it were sudden, but which, in the slow context of the afternoon, becomes as soothing as the purr of a cat or the hum of bees in a distant hedge. The plates, one by one, emerge clean and bright on their inner faces, the outer faces also wiped down to remove the gummy oil and any surface dirt. By the time you scrub the 8th plate, the wire brush has left a faint metallic smell on your skin, and your forearms feel pleasantly tired. You take a break from the scrubbing to rinse your hands in the quenching bucket, swishing them in the cool water and watching the rust-darkened drips fall away into the clay depths. You dry your hands on a clean corner of the rag and then tend to the one loose brass loop on the 4th plate, the rivet that had wiggled when you tested it earlier. A small ball peen hammer and a tiny flat-faced stake are all you need. You slide the stake inside the curve of the plate so its flat end supports the head of the loose rivet, and then you tap the peened end on the outside of the plate very gently. 2 light strokes that are more a pat than a blow, and the rivet tightens snug against the iron with a soft click. You test it with your fingernail and find it solid, the brass now immobile, and you nod once before setting the plate back in its row. The next stage is the cutting of the new leather straps. You walk to the wooden chest in the corner and lift the lid, taking out the roll of ox leather you had set aside earlier. The hide is a 1/4 shoulder piece, vegetable tanned to a warm light brown color that will darken with handling and oil over time. It is about the thickness of 2 barley grains laid flat, flexible but strong, and its grain side is smooth and even, without scars or thin spots. You spread the leather on the bench and smooth it with your palm, feeling the slight coolness of the material and the way it resists stretching when you pull it gently lengthwise. Beside the hide you lay one of the old strap fragments that have been long enough to preserve its original shape, a strip about the length of your middle finger and the width of your thumb, with a knife-cut hole at each end. This old strap will serve as a pattern for the new ones, and you align it carefully on the leather so the grain runs in the same direction. You take up the sharp knife again and begin to cut. The blade sinks into the leather with a soft, satisfying resistance, and you draw it along a straight edge that you have marked with a light scratch from a scribe, cutting slowly to ensure the line stays true. The leather parts in a smooth, clean line, the edges slightly darker where the blade has compressed the fibers. You cut one strip, then another, and then a third, laying them out on the bench in a neat row. You will need 3 new straps for each plate, which means 24 straps in total, plus a few spares in case of error, so you settle into the cutting with the same calm repetition that has characterized everything else you have done today. The knife strokes become automatic. The sound of the blade slicing through hides a soft, rhythmic whisper that blends with the distant call of the aqueduct water and the occasional settling of the forge coals. You turn the leather roll as needed, always cutting along the grain, and the pile of new straps grows steadily on the bench. When you have cut enough strips, you gather them into a loose bundle and set them aside while you prepare for the hole punching. You take up the sharp awl, its polished bone handle warm from resting on the bench, and you select a small wooden mallet from the tool rack, a mallet with a head of dogwood, dense and heavy, that has been used for punching leather since before you arrived at this workshop. You also take a scrap of thick hide and place it under the spot where the awl will exit, so that the point does not strike the benchwood and dull itself. Then you begin to punch holes, using the old strap as a guide for the spacing. The awl point sinks through the leather with a crisp, clean pop, and a tiny plug of hide falls away onto the bench, leaving behind a perfect round hole that will accept the brass loop. You punch one hole, then reposition the leather, punch the second hole, and move to the next strap. The mallet makes a soft, hollow thud each time it strikes the top of the awl handle, a gentle sound that has no echo and that dissipates immediately into the still air of the workshop. By the time all the straps are punched, your hand has grown accustomed to the weight of the mallet and the angle of the awl, and the work has become so smooth that it feels less like labor and more like a quiet, focused meditation. Now comes the final assembly, the slow threading of leather through brass. You pick up the first plate and lay it convex side down on the bench, so the inner face with its 3 pairs of brass loops is exposed. You take one of the new straps and fold it neatly in half, then thread the folded end through the upper left loop of the first pair, pulling it through until about 2 finger widths of leather extend from the far side. You then thread the two loose ends through the corresponding loop on the adjacent plate, which you have positioned beside the first, drawing the strap snug so the plates overlap by the correct amount. The leather glides through the brass with a faint, silky friction, and you pull just firmly enough to close the gap between the iron edges without over-tightening. Then you fold the loose ends back against the strap and tie a flat, square knot, pulling it down until it lies flush and even, the two short tails lying parallel along the line of the leather. You trim the excess with a small pair of shears, leaving a neat end about the width of a grain of wheat, and you press the knot flat with your thumb. The first pair of loops is now connected, and you move to the middle pair, repeating the same process: fold, thread, pull, tie, trim, press. The leather smells cleanly of its tannin, a slightly earthy, nutty scent that mixes pleasantly with the lingering vinegar and the warm charcoal of the forge. The third pair of loops follows, and then the first plate is fully attached to the second. The two pieces of armor now linked by three flexible leather hinges that allow them to move and breathe and yet remain securely joined. You lift the two connected plates and flex them gently, watching how the leather yields and how the iron slides smoothly without catching. The movement is satisfying in a deep, quiet way, the way a well-made thing always is. You set the joined plates down and pick up the third plate, positioning it below the second so that the next set of loops aligns. The threading routine begins again, and you lose all sense of the passing minutes. The only things in the world now are the plates, the leather straps, the brass loops, and the steady, repetitive motion of your hands. You thread the folded leather through the loop, pull it snug, tie the knot, trim the end, press it flat, and then move to the next loop. The sounds that accompany this work are so soft that they barely register even in the quiet of the workshop. The whisper of leather rubbing against iron, the faint clink of a brass loop tapping the bench when you shift a plate, the tiny snip of the shears, the rhythmic pad of your thumb pressing the knots. Outside, the world continues in its own parallel way, but it does not intrude. The day has grown warmer, and a slight shimmer of heat now rises from the forge chimney, but you notice it only as a distant, unimportant fact. By the time you reach the fifth plate, your hands have found a pace that is completely natural, and your mind is entered a state where the work seems to do itself. You are aware of the increasing weight of the connected armor as more plates are added, the way the stack becomes gradually heavier and more substantial under your hands. But this awareness is gentle, without urgency. You pause once to refill your water cup and drink, the liquid cool and tasteless in a pleasant way, and you stretch your fingers briefly to loosen them. A small bird flits past the open doorway, its shadow flicking across the bench and then vanishing, and you watch the empty air for a moment before returning to the sixth plate. The seventh and eighth plates are joined with the same quiet care as the first two. The final strap is threaded, the final knot is tied and trimmed, and you sit back on the stool with the completed lorica segmentata hanging from your hands. The assembly is a curved, articulated section of armor that spans from upper chest to just below the ribcage, each plate overlapping the one below it like the scales of a pine cone. The leather hinges, allowing the whole thing to flex inward when you compress it and spring back when you release. The new leather is a warm light brown against the dark grey iron, and the brass loops glint softly where they catch the light. You turn the armor over and check every knot, every loop, every edge, tugging gently here and there to make sure the leather is secure and the plates move as they should. Everything holds. The armor is once again a living, flexible whole, ready to be buckled onto a soldier's torso and to move with him as he marches, bends, and breathes. You lay the completed segmentata section on the clean linen cloth that you had spread near the back of the bench, positioning it carefully so the plates lie flat and the leather straps are not twisted. It joins the helmet and the greave, a growing collection of restored pieces that now fills the cloth with the quiet evidence of the day's slow progress. The linen itself is a simple square of undyed flax, but as you look at the three pieces resting on it, you feel the same mild, wordless satisfaction that comes from a garden row, straightened, or a stack of firewood neatly piled. The feeling does not demand anything. It simply sits in your chest like a small, warm stone, present and undemanding. You roll your shoulders, working out the slight stiffness that has gathered there from hunching over the leatherwork, and you walk a few steps to the doorway to look out at the lane. The fuller's cloth is drying on its rack, lifting very slightly in the breeze, and the potter is now gone, his bowls lined up on the rack, and his wheels silent under a damp cloth. The sun has passed its highest point and is beginning the long, lazy descent toward the western hills, though there are many hours of daylight left yet. The shadow of the workshop wall now falls at a slant across the lane, and a cat sits in the patch of sun beside the bathhouse furnace, washing one paw with slow, deliberate licks. You watch the cat for a little while, finding nothing in its movements except the pleasure of watching something clean itself in the sun, and then you turn back into the smithy to face the next of the tasks that wait on the bench, the folded square of chainmail that needs its missing rings. With the segmentata armor now resting whole and flexible on the linen cloth beside the helmet and the greave, you turn your attention to the folded square of chainmail that has waited at the far right end of the bench through all the earlier tasks. It is a partial sleeve of hamata, meant to cover the upper arm from shoulder to elbow, and it sits there like a heavy dark grey net that has collapsed into itself under its own weight. You lift it with both hands, feeling the thousands of tiny iron rings shift against one another in a liquid, slithering motion, the mail draping over your fingers and pouring down toward the bench in a cascade of cold metal. The weight is surprising each time you handle it, not because it is huge, but because the mail concentrates so much iron into such a compact, flexible form, and you hold it for a moment simply to feel the way it moves. A dense, murmuring mass that conforms to whatever shape you give it. You carry the chainmail to the center of the bench where the light from the high window falls brightest, and you spread it out flat, untucking the folded edges and smoothing the mesh with patient, open palms. The rings are small, each one no wider than the nail on your smallest finger, and they alternate in the standard 4-in-1 pattern that links every solid, punched ring with 4 of its riveted neighbors. The visual rhythm of this weave is so familiar to your eyes that you could recognize a single broken ring from across the room, and as your gaze travels over the spread-out surface, you quickly locate the damaged area, the tear about the length of your thumb, where the rings have been stressed beyond their strength and snapped apart, leaving a ragged gap rimmed by a handful of distorted, stretched rings that no longer sit flush in the pattern. The hole is not large, perhaps a dozen missing rings in total, but the surrounding links have also suffered, pulled into narrow ovals that will need to be replaced to restore the mesh to its proper, even tension. You reach out and lift the edge of the tear, very gently between thumb and forefinger, and the broken rings curl backward like tiny claws, the fractured ends bright and silvery where they parted. The work ahead is quiet and unhurried, a task that asks for patience more than strength, and you gather the few tools you will need from their places on the bench and the rack. The 2 small pliers with thin, well-aligned jaws are already lying crosswise over the chainmail, and you pick them up, one in each hand, feeding the familiar weight of their worn wooden handles and the slight springiness of the iron that will open and close the rings. Alongside the pliers, you take the coil of soft iron wire that has been waiting since the morning, a spiral of metal about the size of a sparrow's nest, dark with mill scale and wound tight upon itself. A small pair of shears for cutting the wire into individual ring blanks joins the collection, and so does the tiny riveting hammer with a head no larger than a bean and a handle you can hide in your closed fist. The final tool is a minuscule flat-faced punch that fits into the hardy hole of a small stake, a tool you will use to set the rivets with the lightest possible tap. All of these you arrange on the bench around the spread-out mail like a craftsman's compass points, ready to guide the work. You settle onto the stool and lean forward, bringing your eyes close to the weave so you can see every detail of the damaged area. The first step is to remove the broken and distorted rings, clearing the site so that new metal can take their place. Holding one plier in your left hand and the other in your right, you locate a ring that has snapped entirely. A riveted ring whose tiny flat disc of a rivet has sheared away and whose ends now gape apart. You grip one side of the broken ring with the left pliers and the other side with the right, and you twist very gently in opposite directions, not to break the ring further, but to open it along its original joint, so it can be withdrawn from the surrounding links without bending any of its neighbors. The iron yields with a faint, dry creak, a sound so small that it is felt more through the handles than heard in the air, and the ring opens enough to allow you to unthread it from the weave. You lift it free and drop it into a small clay dish set aside for scraps, where it lands with a tiny metallic tick. The ring that had been opposite it through the weave, a solid punched ring without a rivet, has also snapped and is even easier to remove. You grip it with one set of pliers and rotate it out with a smooth twisting motion, its hard iron surface scraping softly against the rings that pass through it until it falls loose onto the bench. You work outward from the central hole, removing each broken and distorted ring one at a time, pausing to examine the weave around each removal, to make certain that no hidden cracks have crept into the rings that remain. A stretched ring is sometimes not immediately obvious, but when you press on it with the plier tip, it yields too easily. Its shape no longer a perfect circle, but a narrow oval that has pulled the surrounding weave out of true. Those two you extract with the same careful twisting motion, opening the ring just far enough to slip it from its neighbors and then dropping it into the clay dish. The dish slowly fills with a little pile of broken and misshapen iron, each scrap no larger than a grain of barley, but collectively marking the boundary of the repair that is about to be rebuilt. After a short while, you have cleared the entire damaged zone, leaving behind a neat, oval-shaped opening in the mail that is rimmed by sound, healthy rings ready to accept the replacements. You set the pliers down and roll your shoulders, easing the tension that comes from leaning forward with such focused attention. The quiet of the workshop, which had never truly left, reclaims the space fully during this brief pause, and you become aware of the faint, persistent hum of the forge and the soft, rhythmic patter of the fuller's dripping cloth outside. The light through the window has mellowed another small degree, slanting now at a slightly lower angle and catching the edges of the chainmail in tiny glints that wink and vanish as the rings shift with the draft from the door. You pour a little water into your cup and moisten your lips, then turn your attention to the coil of wire because the next phase requires a supply of fresh, unformed rings. You take the coil and the small shears and you begin cutting individual lengths of wire from the free end, each piece measured by eye to match the circumference of the existing rings. The shears make a crisp snipping sound each time they close, and the wire, which is about as thick as a coarse sewing needle, parts cleanly under the blades. You cut one blank, then another, then a third, and soon a small pile of straight iron segments has accumulated on the bench. Each blank will become a ring, but first it must be shaped into a circle, and for the riveted rings, the ends must be flattened to receive the tiny rivet. The solid punched rings are simpler to make, requiring only that you wrap the wire around a mandrel to form a circle and then cut the ends flush. But since the damaged area contains a mix of both types, you will need to create both varieties as you rebuild the weave. You retrieve the mandrel from its hook on the wall, a smooth iron rod about the thickness of your finger, polished bright by the friction of countless rings being formed around it. Holding the mandrel in your left hand, you take a cut wire blank and place it against the rod. Then press down with your thumb and begin to curl the wire around the rod's circumference, bending it by hand into a nearly closed circle. The iron is soft enough to yield to your fingers, and it wraps around the mandrel with a gentle, even curve, the two ends coming together in a tight seam that leaves only a hair's gap between them. You slide the newly formed ring off the mandrel and examine it, then place it with the others. The solid rings need no rivet. They will be closed by being sprung into place, their own spring tension holding them firmly in the weave once they are linked. The riveted rings require a slight further step. You take each blank, shape it into a circle, and then lay it on the small flat section of anvil-like surface set into the bench, where you tap the ends lightly with the tiny hammer to flatten them just enough that a rivet can be punched through and peened. The tapping is a barely audible series of minuscule ticks, like the sound of a distant insect, and the flattened ends gleam slightly as the iron compresses under the hammer. When you have prepared a generous supply of both solid and riveted rings, you arrange them in two separate piles to the left of the mail, and then you begin the slow process of reweaving the gap. You pick up a solid ring first and thread it through the 4 existing rings that rim the opening, following the pattern that your eyes have already memorized. The ring passes through the 4 neighbors with a soft, silky friction, and you then close it by pressing the ends together with the pliers, the spring tension snapping the ends into alignment with a faint, precise click. The new ring now sits as if it had always been there, perfectly integrated into the weave. You test its placement by wiggling it gently with the plier tip, and it holds firm, neither too tight nor too loose, just one link among many. The next ring is a riveted one, and the process is more delicate. You take one of the prepared blanks with flattened ends, thread it through its designated neighbors in the pattern, and then close it so the two flat ends overlap exactly. Now you must set the rivet. From a small compartment in the wooden tool chest, you take a single minuscule iron rivet, no larger than a grain of sand, holding it on the tip of a slightly moistened finger. You lay the rivet across the overlapping flattened ends, positioning it with the point of a thin awl that you keep for just this purpose, and then you place the whole assembly on the tiny flat stake. The riveting hammer, which you lift with just 2 fingers around its slender handle, descends once, twice, 3 times in a rhythm so light and rapid that it sounds like a single soft chirr. The rivet head peens over into a flat, even disc that locks the ring closed forever. You white the spot with the pad of your thumb, feeling the smoothness of the rivet head and the seams join, and then you move to the next ring. The work of rebuilding the chainmail is a quiet, repetitive flow that unfolds one link at a time. There is no heat, no loud noise, only the small sounds of metal touching metal. The click of a ring closing, the faint snip of the shears when you cut a new blank, the soft tick of the hammer on a rivet, the gentle rustle of the finished mesh as it shifts under your hands. Your breathing falls into a slow, even rhythm that seems to synchronize with the tiny motions of your fingers, and the boundary between action and awareness blurs until you are no longer thinking about the work, but are simply doing it. Your hands moving with the calm, practiced certainty of long habit. The gap in the mail shrinks, ring by ring, the empty oval filling with new links that replicate the ancient pattern exquisitely. From time to time you pause to examine the growing repair, tilting the mail so that the light from the window can shine through the mesh and reveal any irregularity. Each new ring sits in the same plane as the old ones, its curve identical, its rivet flush. The color of the new iron is slightly darker than the weathered gray of the original mail, marked by a faint bloom of forged scale from the wire coil. But you know that with a little handling and oil, the new rings will soon darken to match the rest. The repair will be invisible to any eye that does not know exactly where to look, and even then it will be hard to find. That is the aim of all your work today, to make the damage disappear so completely that the armor can return to its owner as if it had never been harmed. And as you weave the last few rings into place, you feel the quiet satisfaction of seeing that goal come near. When the final rivet has been tapped flat and the last solid ring has been sprung shut, you lift the entire chainmail sleeve and hold it up before you, letting it drape from your hands. The mesh hangs in a supple, fluid sheet, every ring moving independently and yet held in the collective pattern. The gap now seamlessly filled and the surrounding area restored to full strength. You flex the mail gently, bunching it together and then releasing it, and the rings slide over one another with a soft, hissing murmur that sounds like a very distant sea. The sleeve is whole again, ready to protect an arm from the slice of a blade or the jab of a spear, and yet it is also light and flexible, a second skin of iron that will move with the soldier and impose no burden beyond its modest weight. You lay the repaired chainmail on the clean linen cloth beside the segmentata, the greave, and the helmet, arranging it so that it forms a neat folded square like the one you had first picked up. The cloth now holds 4 pieces of armor, each one transformed from its damaged state by the slow, quiet labor of the day, and the sight of them together is a muted, private reward that you take in without ceremony. You stretch your fingers, which have grown slightly stiff from the precise work with the pliers and the tiny hammer, and you rub your palms together to work the coolness out of the knuckles. A glance toward the window tells you that the sun has moved another small increment across the sky, the rectangle of light now climbing the opposite wall and beginning to thin at its edges as the afternoon advances. The shadows in the corners of the workshop have deepened very slightly, and the coals in the forge have settled into a low, glowing bed that you will soon need to stir if you are to complete the last of the day's repairs, the sharpening of the gladius that still leans against the bench leg. But before you rise to tend the fire or take up the whetstone, you permit yourself a short moment of stillness, sitting on the stool with your hands resting loose on your thighs and your eyes half closed. The chain of the day's tasks runs through your mind, not as a list but as a texture. The smooth bronze of the helmet, the gritty sand of the slow cooling greave, The dry rasp of the vinegar-scrubbed plates, the silky pull of leather through brass loops, and the tiny, intricate clicks of the chainmail rings. Each texture blends into the next, and the whole feels like a single, unbroken thing, a day that has been lived as much as worked. The sounds of the lane beyond the door have softened into the rhythm of the later afternoon. The fuller's cloth, now still and dry, the potter long gone, and the cats no longer in the sun patch. The world waits with you, unhurried, for the next small task to begin. The gladius still leans against the leg of the workbench where you placed it in the early morning, its tip resting on a folded scrap of leather and its pommel angled outward toward the room. You reach down and pick it up now, lifting it into the light that has grown softer and more golden as the afternoon advances toward its later hours. The sword is a standard legionary pattern, the blade just under 2 feet long from the guard to the triangular point, double-edged, and forged from a single bar of medium carbon steel that holds an edge well without becoming brittle. The hilt is wrapped in ridged bone, yellowed with age and darkened in the hollows where a soldier's grip has worn it smooth, and the round wooden pommel is pegged solidly with an iron pin that shows no sign of loosening. The guard is a simple oval of hardwood, slightly scorched at the edges from the heat of the tang being driven through, and it sits square and tight against the shoulders of the blade. You hold the gladius horizontally and turn it so the window light slides along the edge from the guard to the point. The nicks are immediately visible, small irregularities where the steel has been toned back by repeated cuts against the wooden training posts, each nick no larger than a grain of barley and clustered mostly in the middle third of the blade where the cutting action falls naturally. The tip has a very slight curl, too subtle to be seen from every angle, but unmistakable when you sight down the length of the sword with one eye closed, a tiny hook that would catch on a fingernail if drawn across it. The fuller groove running down the center of the blade is clean and free of rust, a good sign that the soldier who owns this gladius oils it regularly. But the edge itself is done enough to press your thumb against without drawing blood, which you test once, lightly, to confirm what your eyes have already told you. The sword needs nothing more than a careful honing, a restoration of its keenness that will take patience and a steady hand. You carry the gladius to the corner of the workshop where the sharpening station is set up on a low, sturdy table that you built long ago from a salvaged door plank. The table is heavy and does not wobble, its surface scarred with years of oil spills and the fine grey dust of stone and steel. On it rest the tools you will need, a rectangular whetstone of fine-grained sandstone about the length of your forearm and the width of your palm, its surface worn smooth in the center, from countless blades being drawn across it. A smaller, finer stone of dense novaculite for the final passes. A thick leather strop glued to a flat oak board and smeared with a paste of fine pumice powder and olive oil. A small flask of clean olive tunic. You set the gladius down on the table with the hilt to your right and the point to your left, and you pour a little water from a clay jug into a shallow dish, not for the sharpening itself, but for your fingers, which you will need to keep clean and moist enough to feel the burr when it rises. The first stone, the rectangular sandstone, you lift and set squarely before you, bracing it against a small wooden cleat nailed to the table so it cannot slide. You take the flask of olive oil and tip it, letting a thin, pale stream spiral onto the stone in a line that follows the long axis, the oil puddling slightly before it spreads into a glossy film. The smell of the oil is mild and fruity, with a faint greenness that reminds you of the olive press near the river, and it mixes with the ever-present charcoal and iron of the workshop into a blend that is by now as familiar as the scent of your own skin. You pick up the gladius in your right hand, curling your fingers around the hilt just behind the guard, and you place the fingertips of your left hand lightly on the flat of the blade near the bolster so you can feel the angle. The correct angle for honing is a shallow one, not much more than the thickness of a copper coin lifted from the stone, and you set the edge against the oiled surface with that angle held steady by the muscle memory that lives in your wrist and forearm. You begin to draw the blade across the stone. The stroke starts at the guard and travels all the way to the point, a long, smooth pass that presses the edge against the abrasive with an even, moderate pressure that lightens just at the end, so the tip does not catch and roll. The sound is a low, liquid shing, a whisper of steel parting oil and biting into stone, continuous from start to finish, and then gone, replaced by the brief silence of the return. You lift the blade, turn it, and make the same stroke on the other side, the edge now trailing across the stone in the opposite direction, the sound identical in its soft, hissing texture. You count the strokes in your mind as you work, 10 on the first side, 10 on the second, each stroke a full length of the blade and each return unhurried. The nicks begin to vanish almost at once, their tiny folded edges peeling away into the oil as dark microscopic threads that stain the stone in a faint grey halo. After the first set of 10, you stop and wipe the blade clean with a rag, holding it up to the light to inspect the edge. The nicks have grown shallower, and the tip curl has begun to straighten, but the edge is not yet sharp. It still shows a thin line of reflected light, a wire edge that tells you the steel has been abraded, but not yet refined. You pour another thin line of oil onto the stone, spreading it with a fingertip, and resume. This time you count 9 strokes on the first side, 9 on the second, a slight reduction that accounts for the diminishing amount of metal that needs to be removed. The rhythm of the work settles into your body as it always does. The long forward push, the soft hiss, the lift, the turn, the mirror stroke on the other side, the count ticking down in a quiet corner of your attention. 8 strokes follow on each side, then 7, and by the time you reach 6, the counting has dissolved into the motion no longer needed because your fingers can feel the edge sharpening, the slight drag against the stone shifting from a rough catch to a smooth, singing glide. You lift the blade and wipe it again, this time feeling the edge carefully with the ball of your thumb, drawing it across the steel at a flat angle so you do not cut yourself. A fine burr has risen, a tiny, wire-like lip of metal that is too small to see, but distinct to the touch, and it runs the full length of the blade on one side. You turn the gladius and feel the other side, finding a matching burr there, and you know that the first stone has done its primary work. The edge is now geometrically correct, the nicks gone, the tip straight, but the burr must be refined away on the finer stone before the blade can be considered truly sharp. You set the sandstone aside and lift the smaller novaculite stone, a dense, almost glassy rock of a pale cream color that came from a quarry far to the east and cost more than a month's wages, but has lasted for years and will last for many more. The surface is so smooth it reflects the window light in a soft, even glow, and you oil it with the same olive oil, a sparing amount because the fine stone does not absorb as much. You then lift the gladius and begin the final passes. The stroke is lighter now, a delicate, feathery contact that barely presses the blade against the stone, but allows the fine abrasive to polish away the burr and refine the edge to a keen, even apex. The sound is a softer, higher whisper, almost a sigh, and it seems to float in the air rather than cut through it. You make 5 strokes on one side, then 5 on the other, then 3, then 2, then 1 final stroke so light it is more a thought than an action, and you stop. The blade is now sharp enough to shave the hair from your arm, which you test by bringing the edge close to your forearm and watching a few fine hairs spring away before the steel even touches them. But the sharpening is not complete until the edge has been stropped, because the finest stone still leaves behind a microscopic sawtooth that the leather and pumice can polish into a truly smooth, long-lasting keenness. You set the novaculite stone aside and draw the strop toward you across the table. The leather is thick oxhide, its grain side up, and it has been treated with a paste of pumice powder worked into olive oil until it forms a smooth dark grey coating that clings to the surface like a thin layer of clay. You grasp the gladius by the hilt again, but this time you draw the blade backward across the strop, edge trailing, so the leather polishes the steel without cutting into it. The stroke is long and steady from guard to point with the same careful angle you used on the stones, and the sound is a soft, rhythmic shur that alternates with the silence of the return. You make 10 passes, then flip the blade and make 10 passes on the other side, the leather warming slightly under the friction and releasing a faint, earthy scent of hide and pumice. When the stropping is done, you wipe the entire blade with a clean, oiled cloth, removing every trace of stone dust and pumice residue. The steel now gleams with a deep, liquid luster, the fuller groove a dark satin stripe down the center, and the edges 2 bright lines that converge at the restored point. You hold the gladius up in the late afternoon light and sight along the edge once more, finding no nicks, no curl, no imperfections, only the smooth, unbroken line of a properly honed weapon. The sword feels alive in your hand in the way that only a well-sharpened blade can. Its balance point just forward of the guard, its weight enough to cut but not to tire, its edge a promise of effortless slicing that you will never need to test yourself, because your job is not to use the blade but to make it ready. You set the gladius down on the table and wipe your hands on a rag, then pour a fresh splash of olive oil onto a soft cloth and run it along the blade one final time, a thin protective film that will guard against rust until the soldier reclaims his sword. The oil darkens the steel very slightly, giving it a deeper, richer tone, and the smell of the oil mingles with the quiet satisfaction of a task completed. You take up the scabbard that had been resting on the shelf beneath the window, a simple leather sheath reinforced with a brass chape and throat, its surface tooled with a plain diamond pattern that has worn nearly smooth from years of rubbing against a soldier's belt. You inspect the inside of the scabbard by holding it up to the light and peering down its throat, seeing the remnants of the fleece lining that has matted down over time, but still offers a soft, snug grip for the blade. The scabbard is in acceptable condition, dry but not cracked, and you run an oiled finger around the inside of the throat to lubricate it before you slide the gladius home. The blade enters the scabbard with a smooth, steady motion, the steel whispering against the fleece until the guard seats against the throat with a soft final click. The sound is satisfying in a deep, quiet way, a sound that signals completion not with a fanfare, but with the simple certainty of a door closing snugly against its frame. You turn the scabbarded sword over in your hands, checking that the fit is secure and that the brass chape at the tip is still firmly attached, and then you carry it to the linen cloth where the other repaired pieces rest. You lay the gladius beside the chainmail, the segmentata, the greave and the helmet, a fifth piece added to the collection of restored armor, and you step back to look at them all together. The linen cloth now holds a nearly complete set of legionary equipment, each piece bearing the quiet marks of your attention. The bronze helmet gleams without a trace of its former dent. The iron greave is solid and smooth, the segmentata plates flex easily on their new leather hinges, the chainmail sleeve drapes in a seamless mesh, and the gladius waits in its scabbard with a newly honed edge that needs only to be drawn to prove its sharpness. The sight is not dramatic, not triumphant, but it fills you with the same calm, unspoken satisfaction that you feel when the last row of seeds is planted or the final tile of a roof is laid. The world has been put a little more in order, and that is enough. The light through the high window has continued its slow journey, and by now the rectangle on the floor has climbed the opposite wall and thinned to a narrow, pale strip that barely reaches the rafters. The air in the workshop has cooled a little, the warmth of the afternoon beginning its slow retreat into evening, and the coals in the forge have dimmed to a low, pulsing glow under a thickening blanket of ash. The sounds from the lane outside have changed character as well. The fuller has packed away his cloth. The potter's wheel is long silent, and the only noises are the distant, rhythmic tramp of the evening watch making its rounds along the fortress wall, and the softer, nearer cooing of the pigeons settling into the rafters of the granary. A few early stars, still pale and tentative, will soon appear through the open doorway if you care to look. But for now, the sky remains a deep, even blue that is just beginning to darken at its eastern edge. You stand in the middle of the workshop and let your gaze travel slowly around the familiar space. The anvil waits on its block, the forge glows with its banked embers, the tools hang in their ordered rows, and the bench has been gradually cleared of the armor that once covered it. The scrap bucket holds the old leather and the broken rings. The clay dish holds the tiny iron fragments from the chainmail, and the quenching bucket is still and dark with its layer of oil on the water. The day's work has not been rushed, and yet it has brought you to this point with a natural, inevitable flow, as if the hours themselves have guided your hands. You think briefly of the soldiers whose armor this might be, faceless men you will never meet, but whose safety depends on the care you have taken. But the thought is distant and gentle, a passing shadow rather than a burden. Your responsibility ends at the workshop door, and tomorrow the quartermaster will come to collect the repaired pieces and distribute them back to the ranks, and the cycle will begin again. You stretch your arms overhead, feeling the pull on your spine and the release of the slight tension that has gathered between your shoulder blades from bending over the sharpening table. The stretch is a quiet luxury, a small gesture that your body has learned to appreciate after long days of standing and sitting and leaning. You lower your arms and roll your neck once to the left, once to the right, and then you walk to the door and lean against the frame, looking out at the lane and the sky and the stone walls of the fortress that had been the backdrop of your life for as long as memory reaches. The evening is calm, the air cooling, and the world is settling into its own version of rest. But the day is not quite over. There is still the tidying of the shop to attend to, the banking of the fire, the closing of the shutters, and the quiet walk home along the gravel path. Those small rituals will carry you gently from the work of the day into the peace of the night, and you are in no hurry to begin them, because the last hour of a day well spent is its own kind of reward. As the shadows lengthen outside the workshop and the light through the high window thins to a pale watery gold, you turn from the bench where the 5 restored pieces of armor rest on their linen cloth and begin the quiet ritual of tidying the smithy for the night. This is the closing of the day, a sequence of small, unhurried actions that you've performed so many times they have become as natural as breathing, each one a gentle signal to your body and mind that the hours of labor are drawing to their end. The feeling in the room has shifted subtly, the earlier warmth of the afternoon giving way to a cooler, stiller atmosphere that carries the first faint hint of evening, and the coals in the forge have settled into a low, drowsy glow beneath a thickening crust of grey ash. You start at the bench where the tools from the day's various tasks have accumulated in small clusters. A neat and orderly workshop is not a matter of pride for you so much as a matter of comfort. The same way a well-made bed or a swept floor allows the mind to settle without distraction, and you gather the tools now with the same calm attention you gave to spreading them out in the morning. The 3 hammers come first, the small planishing hammer with its domed face that tapped the dent from the bronze helmet, the cross-peen that welded the patch to the greave, and the tiny ball-peen that set the rivets in the chainmail rings. You lift each one in turn, wiping its head with an oily rag to remove any trace of metal dust or borax residue, and then you hang it on its designated hook on the wall rack, the hammer handles sliding into their accustomed places with a soft, hollow clunk of wood against iron. The pliers from the chainmail work are next, their thin noses still slightly warm from the heat of your hands, and you wipe them too, opening and closing the jaws once to make sure no tiny fragment of iron wire has lodged itself in the hinge before you return them to their hook. The wire brush you clean by tapping it gently against the side of the scrap bucket, a fine shower of dried vinegar paste and rust dust falling away into the darkness of the bucket, and then you hang it on its nail near the forge where it will be ready for the next day. The awl and the mallet go back into the small clay pot on the corner of the bench, the awl point down, the mallet head resting on a scrap of leather so the dogwood does not crack. The knife you wipe carefully with the oily rag, checking the edge for any nicks that might have appeared during the cutting of the leather straps, and finding none you slide it into its sheath of boiled leather and place it on the shelf under the bench. The whetstone and the novaculite stone you clean by wiping them with a damp cloth until the dark grey slurry of oil and steel dust lifts away, revealing the pale, smooth surfaces beneath, and then you set them back on the sharpening table with the strop laid flat beside them, its leather surface covered by a clean scrap of linen to keep the dust from settling in the pumice paste. The oil flask you stopper tightly and return to its spot, and the pile of rags you shake out over the scrap bucket before folding them into a neat stack on the corner of the sharpening table. With the small tools attended to, you move to the anvil. The face of the anvil has gathered a fine dusting of iron scale and borax splatter from the welding work on the greave, and you take up a stiff boar bristle brush with a short wooden handle and sweep it across the anvil face in long, even strokes that push the debris toward the edge and then over, the tiny dark flakes falling onto the packed earth floor in a narrow line. The brush makes a soft, rhythmic skish with each stroke, a sound that is half whisper and half scratch, and it stirs up a faint metallic scent that hangs in the air for a moment before dissipating. You brush the horn of the anvil, the flat top, and the step where the chisel plate sits, and then you run the brush around the base where the anvil meets the oaken block, clearing away the iron dust that has accumulated in the crevices. The rounded stake you remove from the hardy hole with a firm upward pull, and you wipe it with the oily rag before returning it to the shelf beneath the tool rack, its polished surface gleaming once before the shadows swallow it. The flat stake from the chainmail riveting you also wipe and put away, and the small wire clamp you had used to hold the patch to the greave you straighten and hang on a small nail near the forge tools. ready for the next time it is needed. Now you turn your attention to the forge. The fire has grown quiet and low, the mound of charcoal reduced to a bed of glowing embers that pulse with a deep, ruby light barely visible beneath the covering of ash. The chimney draws gently, a faint column of warm air still rising, and the smell of the charcoal is milder now, less sharp than it was during the peak of the day's heat. You take the iron rake from its hook and gently stir the coals, breaking apart the clumps of fused ash and bringing the still glowing nuggets to the surface so they can burn themselves out safely over the course of the night. A few sparks rise in a lazy spiral, orange against the dimming light of the workshop, and you watch them climb the dark chimney throat and vanish. When you are satisfied that no hidden pockets of intense heat remain that might flare up after you have left, you take the small iron scoop that hangs beside the rake and lift a generous measure of cool, dead ash from the ash bucket that sits beneath the forge lip. You sprinkle this ash over the remaining embers in a slow, even layer, watching as the red glow dims and fades beneath the grey blanket, the fire banking itself for the night in the same way a farmer covers the last coals of a cooking fire with earth. The ash settles with a soft, powdery sigh, and the forge is now asleep, warm but not dangerous, ready to be woken again with fresh kindling when you return in the morning. The bench itself needs clearing and wiping. You gather the scraps of old leather from the segmentata repair, the brittle brown fragments that had been the original straps, and you sweep them into your cupped hand and drop them into the scrap bucket. The squares of coarse sacking that had separated the plates you fold and set on the shelf for reuse, and the clay dish of broken chainmail rings you empty into a small storage jar that holds other such fragments, because iron can always be melted down and reforged, and nothing in your workshop is truly wasted. The damp rags you used for wiping the vinegar paste from the plates you take outside to the water barrel and rinse thoroughly, wringing them out with a firm twist of your wrists before hanging them over the wooden rail beside the door to dry in the night air. The quenching bucket you check, lifting the clay lid that fits over its top, and you see that the water is still reasonably clean, the oil slick on top undisturbed and the level only slightly lower than it was in the morning. You add a ladleful of fresh water from the jug, enough to bring it back to its proper mark, and then you replace the lid and wipe the outside of the bucket with a dry cloth to remove the splashes that had dried there during the busy parts of the day. The floor of the workshop receives your attention now. You take the broom from its corner beside the door, a bundle of stiff broomcorn bound to a smooth ash handle, and you begin to sweep the packed earth in long, steady strokes that move from the back wall toward the door. The broom gathers up the day's debris, the grey dust of iron filings, the dark specks of borax glass, the tiny curls of leather trimmings, the occasional drop rivet that you stoop to retrieve and drop into the storage jar, and the fine gritty powder of charcoal ash that has drifted from the forge. The bristles make a soft, shushing sound as they travel across the floor, a sound that is both cleaning and soothing, and a thin cloud of dust rises in the shaft of window light and dances there for a moment before settling into the pile you are pushing toward the threshold. You sweep the pile over the doorsill and out into the lane where the evening breeze will scatter it harmlessly, and then you lean the broom back in its corner and dust your hands off on the sides of your leather apron. The leather apron itself you untie next, lifting the loop over your head and loosening the waist straps with the ease of long practice. The apron is heavy and dark with years of oil and sweat, and the tiny burns that have peppered its surface like a map of 1,000 working days, and you shake it out over the scrap bucket before folding it in half and hanging it on the wooden peg beside the door. Your tunic, which had been clean this morning, now bears the marks of the day, a smudge of charcoal on the sleeve, a dark spot of vinegar on the hem, and the fine grey dust of honing compound worked into the weave near the collar. You brush at the worst of the marks with your palm, but the tunic will want washing before long, a task for another day, and for now it is simply the garment of the man who has done his work. You slip your sandals back on after shaking out the grit that had worked its way between your toes during the sweeping, and you knot the straps loosely, feeling the familiar pressure of the leather across your instep. Now, with the workshop clean and the tools put away and the fire banked and the floor swept, you turn your attention to the linen cloth where the repaired armor rests. The 5 pieces sit there in quiet formation, each one transformed from its damaged state by the slow, patient hours of the day. You lift the bronze helmet first and turn it in your hands one final time, running your thumb over the cheek guard where the dent had been, and feeling only the smooth, unbroken curve of the restored metal. The helmet catches the last of the window light and glows with a warm, honeyed luster, and you set it down on the cloth with the care you would give to a sleeping child. The iron greave you check next, sighting along the weld line and finding it invisible, the patch fully blended into the surrounding metal, the surface cool and solid under your touch. The segmentata armor you flex gently, listening to the soft, reassuring creak of the new leather straps as the plates move against one another, each hinge supple and strong. The chainmail sleeve you lift and let drape across your palm, the thousands of tiny rings shifting with their liquid murmur, and you run your finger over the repaired area where the new rings sit flush and even, already darkening to match the older metal. And the gladius you take up last, drawing it part way from its scabbard, just to see the gleam of the honed edge in the fading light, the blade a bright line of readiness, before you slide it home again with that soft final click that you have come to associate with the end of a day's work. You arrange the 5 pieces on the linen cloth so that they sit neatly together, the helmet at the top, the greave below it, the segmentata in the center, the chainmail folded beside it, and the gladius laid diagonally across one corner. The quartermaster will come in the morning to collect them, and by midday they will be back in the hands of the soldiers whose names are written on small leather tags tied to each piece. Tags that you checked earlier to make sure the repairs are matched to the right owners. Until then, the armor will rest here in the darkness of the closed workshop, safe and whole, waiting for the light of another day. You walk to the window and close the shutters, drawing the wooden panels inward until they meet with a soft, hollow thump. The iron latch drops into its slot with a small click, and the last of the outside light is cut off, leaving the workshop in a deep, brownish dusk that smells of wood and iron and the faint, lingering ghost of the day's charcoal. You walk to the door and step outside for a moment, not to leave yet, but to take one last look at the lane and the sky. The air is cool now, carrying the damp, green scent of the river and the earthier smell of the potter's kiln, which has been lit for the night, firing and sends a thin, straight plume of white smoke into the darkening blue. The first stars have appeared above the fortress wall, pale specks that you can only see if you look slightly to the side of them, and the slender curve of the moon hangs low over the granary roof, a thin silver arc that tonight holds no more warmth than a smile remembered from a dream. The lane is empty, except for the cat you saw earlier, now curled into a tight ball on the still warm stones near the bathhouse furnace, its flank rising and falling in the slow rhythm of feline sleep. You watch the cat for a short while, finding in its peaceful stillness a mirror of your own quiet mood, and then you step back inside. You slide the heavy wooden bolt across the door, the iron shaft grating once against its bracket before it settles into its slot with a solid, final thud. The sound marks the true end of the working day, a boundary between the world of labor and the world of rest, and you stand for a moment in the closed, dark workshop, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness and your breathing slow to the pace of the quiet room. The forge makes a very faint, continuous hiss, the last warmth of the banked embers drawing air through the chimney, and somewhere in the rafters a small creature stirs once and is still. The workshop feels peaceful now, not empty, but resting, its tools and its anvil and its benches all holding the memory of the day's work in their silent, waiting forms. You turn to the door and draw the bolt back, just enough to slip outside, pulling the door closed behind you with a soft, firm pressure until the latch catches. You test the door once with your palm, finding it secure, and then you begin the walk home. The gravel path crunches under your hobnailed sandals in a slow, even rhythm, each step a small, solid sound that joins the larger quiet of the evening. To your left, the fortress wall stretches away in its massive, darkening bulk, the sentry at the gate now holding a small oil lamp that makes a pool of warm yellow light against the stone. To your right, the civilian houses are lit from within by the flicker of cooking fires, and the smell of barley porridge and stewed lentils drifts out through open windows, making your stomach remember that you have eaten nothing since the midday bread. The sky has deepened from blue to a rich indigo, and more stars have come out now, spread across the darkness in their ancient, patient patterns. The moon has climbed a little higher, its thin arc brightening as the last of the daylight fades below the western hills. Your small room waits at the end of the gravel path, its clay brick walls still holding a faint memory of the afternoon warmth, and you push open the low wooden door and step inside, leaving the door slightly ajar so the cool night air can follow you in. The oil lamp on the niche shelf is where you left it, and you strike a spark from your flint and steel to light the wick, the small flame catching with a soft pop and filling the room with a warm golden glow that pushes the shadows into the corners. The water jar, the brazier, the straw mattress, the single wooden stool are all exactly as you left them, a small simple space that asks nothing of you except to be inhabited. You pour a basin of water from the jar into a clay bowl and wash your face and hands, the cool water lifting away the last of the day's grime and leaving your skin feeling clean and slightly tight. You dry yourself on a scrap of linen cloth and then set a small pot of barley porridge on the brazier to warm, adding a handful of dried figs to soften in the heat. The porridge is thick and bland and filling, and you eat it slowly, sitting on the stool by the open door and watching the stars brighten above the rooftops. When the porridge is finished and the bowl is rinsed and set aside, you pull off your sandals and lie down on the straw mattress, drawing the wool blanket up to your shoulders. The mattress rustles beneath you in a familiar way, the straw shifting to accommodate the shape of your body, and you settle onto your side with one arm tucked under your head. The light from the oil lamp flickers softly on the walls, and you watch the shadows move for a little while without thinking about them. Through the open door you can hear the very distant sound of the night watch making their rounds, the slow measured tramp of hobnailed boots on the fortress wall, and closer still, the quiet trickle of the aqueduct overflow running into its cistern, a sound that has been the background of every night you have spent in this room. The combination of these sounds, the distant boots and the nearby water, forms a gentle, rhythmic lullaby that your mind has learned to trust, a signal that the day is done and the world is safe and sleep is not far away. You reach up and pinch the wick of the oil lamp, extinguishing the flame with a soft, brief hiss, and the room falls into a deep, comfortable darkness that smells of warm clay and barley and the faint, lingering scent of charcoal from your tunic. The mattress accepts your weight, the blanket holds your warmth, and the silence of the night folds around you like a second blanket, soft and deep and without demand. Your thoughts drift lazily over the textures of the day, the cool curve of the bronze helmet, the warm handle of the planishing hammer, the steady dry sound of the file, the smell of vinegar and leather and quenching water, the slow, satisfying click of the chainmail rings, the gleam of the newly honed sword edge. But the thoughts do not catch. They float past like the dust motes in the window light, visible for a moment and then gone, carried away on the slow current of your breathing. The day asks nothing more of you, and the calm of the workshop follows you into a long, restful sleep, deep and uninterrupted, while the stars wheel slowly overhead and the fortress settles into its own quiet rhythm, waiting for the first pale light of another morning.